4 days after my sister gave birth, she appeared on my doorstep with a newborn carrier in one hand and a suitcase in the other. She moved carefully, still sore from delivery, but her decision was already made. New York had offered her the promotion she had spent years chasing, and she intended to take it. I begged her not to leave her own daughter behind. Celeste set the carrier at my feet and said, "You've cried about being infertile for years. Consider her my gift to you." Then she walked away. 18 years later, her company put one fellowship file in front of her. When she saw the name, she called me for the first time since that night, and the first thing she asked was not how her daughter had been. Before I tell you how we got from that doorway to the phone call 18 years later, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, because what my sister did that night was only the first choice she would eventually have to answer for. And if stories about family, love, and the choices that reveal who we really are mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stay with us. I had expected Celeste to call before coming over. She had always hated arriving anywhere without warning because she believed surprise made people look disorganized, and Celeste had spent most of her adult life trying never to look anything but composed. That was why the sight of her standing beneath the yellow porch light bothered me before I even noticed the baby. It was a cold January evening in northern New Jersey. A thin crust of old snow still lined the edges of my driveway, gray where passing cars had thrown road salt over it. Celeste wore a wool coat left open over loose clothes, and her face looked drained beneath carefully brushed hair. She shifted her weight as if every movement pulled somewhere tender. One hand gripped the handle of a small rolling suitcase. The other held an infant carrier, covered with a pale hospital blanket. For one stupid second, I thought she had come because she needed me. 4 days earlier, I had visited her in the hospital after the delivery. I had held the baby for less than 10 minutes while Celeste slept. Even then, I had been careful about where I looked. Years of infertility had taught me how to admire someone else's newborn without letting my face show everything I had lost. I had learned how to smile at baby showers, how to hold tiny socks in department stores without imagining feet inside them, how to answer well-meaning questions without making other people uncomfortable. Celeste knew all of that. She had known when the specialists finally stopped using hopeful language with me. She had known when I packed away the brochures from the fertility clinic because I could no longer stand seeing them on my kitchen counter. She had sat at this same table while I admitted that some days I hated my own body for making motherhood feel like a locked room I could see through but never enter. I stepped aside and let her into the house. The carrier touched the hardwood first, then the suitcase. Celeste remained standing. I remember that detail because everything about it was wrong. A woman 4 days after giving birth should have been looking for somewhere to sit. She should have been worried about feeding schedules, sleep, pain medication, the terrifying fragility of the person she had just brought into the world. Celeste looked exhausted, yes. Her movements were slow, and once she pressed a palm briefly against her abdomen when she thought I wasn't watching. But beneath the physical exhaustion was something much colder than panic. Preparation. I crouched beside the carrier and pulled the blanket back. Cora was asleep. She had a faint reddish patch across one eyelid and a tiny fist tucked beneath her chin. The hospital bracelet was still around her wrist, loose enough that I could slide one finger beneath it. Her name had not yet become familiar in my mouth. Until that evening, she had still been Celeste's baby, in some corner of my mind. I expected my sister to tell me she needed a few nights of sleep, maybe a week. Maybe she had developed complications, or the doctor had frightened her, or she had discovered that bringing a newborn home was more overwhelming than anything she had imagined. Instead, Celeste told me about New York. Months earlier, she had been competing for a senior strategy position at Hartwell Group. I knew about it because nearly every conversation we had during her pregnancy eventually curved back toward that job. It was not yet the executive title she wanted, but it placed her on a track where those titles became possible. The company wanted an answer immediately and expected her to begin the relocation and transition as soon as she was medically able. She described it the way she described every major career move: dates, expectations, opportunities, consequences. If she turned it down, she believed there would not be another opening like it. Other people were already positioning themselves around the role. She had spent years becoming the woman Hartwell would choose for that kind of work. As she spoke, Cora made a small noise in the carrier. Celeste never looked down. That was when the room began to feel smaller. I asked what any sane person would have asked. What did New York have to do with leaving a 4-day-old baby at my house? Celeste's answer was not dramatic. That made it worse. She said the job required flexibility, travel, long hours, and a level of commitment incompatible with the life she had planned. She had never wanted motherhood to determine which opportunities she could accept. Pregnancy, she said, had already altered enough. She spoke about Cora without cruelty in her voice, only inconvenience. I remember looking at the suitcase again. It was too neatly packed for a woman who had made a desperate decision an hour earlier. I stood and told her she was exhausted and still recovering. She needed time before making anything permanent. I offered the spare room. I offered to help with nights. I told her I could take Cora while she slept, handle appointments for a few weeks, even rearrange my work schedule while she figured out what Hartwell might accommodate. I kept producing solutions because I still believed the problem was logistics. Celeste listened until I ran out of them. Then she told me childcare was not the issue. The sentence settled something inside me. I looked toward the infant carrier again. Cora had opened her eyes. They moved without focus beneath the dim kitchen light, searching for nothing she could yet recognize. I told Celeste that promotions came and went, jobs changed, companies reorganized. Her daughter would only be 4 days old once. That was when she smiled. It was not a joyful smile, or even a mocking one. It was the expression Celeste used when she believed she had found the cleanest solution to a complicated problem. You've cried about being infertile for years. Consider her my gift to you. For a moment, I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. Nothing else. The years I had spent trying to become pregnant seemed to rise between us all at once. Injections laid out beside my bathroom sink, appointment calendars, blood tests, the final quiet office where a doctor had stopped promising possibilities. Celeste had taken the most private grief of my life and placed it beside her newborn daughter, as though one canceled out the other. You cannot have a child. I do not want mine. Problem solved. I looked down at Cora and felt something hotter than anger, because the cruelty of the sentence was larger than what it did to me. Celeste had reduced her daughter to an object transferable between women, according to need. I told her Cora was not a gift. She was her daughter. That was one of the few sentences from that night. I remember saying exactly as I said it, because my voice sounded unfamiliar even to me. Celeste lowered herself carefully into one of my dining chairs then, finally acknowledging what childbirth had done to her body. She waited for the discomfort to pass before explaining that she was not leaving Cora with strangers. She was leaving her with family, with someone who wanted a child, someone who could provide stability. In Celeste's version of events, that made the decision almost generous. I asked what would happen if she regretted it in a month. She said she would not. I asked what happened if the promotion disappeared. Her eyes hardened at that. She said she was not giving up the largest opportunity of her career because she might later become sentimental about a life she had never wanted. I stopped offering emotional arguments and tried practical ones again because practical language was the only language Celeste respected. Hartwell could be asked for transition time. She could relocate gradually. I could help without replacing her. She did not need to choose between accepting the job and permanently abandoning her child. She let me finish. Then she unzipped the outside pocket of her suitcase and placed an envelope on my table. Inside were Cora's discharge information, insurance details, pediatric instructions. and a signed temporary medical and care authorization, naming me as the person permitted to handle immediate decisions, while further arrangements were made. A family law attorney's card was clipped to the front. The paper was dated that morning. I stared at it longer than I needed to. That was the moment I understood my sister had not driven to my house to ask what I thought. She had driven over to execute a plan. The conversation had only been a courtesy. Maybe even that was generous. Celeste explained that the authorization would keep me from running into problems with doctors while her attorney worked out what needed to happen next. She had already spoken with him about a longer arrangement. I heard the phrase, but did not fully absorb it. I was still looking at the signature. Her handwriting was as controlled as always. I asked when she had contacted the lawyer. She did not answer directly. She only said she had wanted to make sure Cora would be protected. The word protected nearly made me laugh, but nothing about the room felt funny. Cora stirred again. Her mouth tightened, and a thin cry escaped before building into something sharper. Instinct moved me before thought did. I lifted her from the carrier, supporting her head the way a maternity nurse had shown me 4 days earlier. She weighed almost nothing. Celeste watched me settle the baby against my chest. I wondered if seeing us together would change something. It did not. Cora's crying eased after a minute, her cheek warm against my shirt. I could smell the clean, powdery hospital scent still clinging to her blanket. Celeste pushed herself out of the chair. She winced. For the first time that evening, I saw how physically vulnerable she actually was. Her body was still recovering from bringing this child into the world, and yet her mind had already moved on to another life. I tried one last time. I told her to leave the suitcase, stay the night, sleep. We could talk tomorrow after she had rested. Nothing had to become permanent at 8 o'clock on a freezing January evening. Celeste placed the attorney's card beside the papers and told me she had already made the decision that gave everyone the best chance at the life they wanted. Everyone. I looked at the newborn in my arms. Cora had not been consulted about the life she wanted. Celeste pulled on her gloves. Her fingers were swollen enough that it took longer than usual. She picked up the suitcase, moved slowly toward the door, and paused there just long enough to say that one day I would understand she had done the sensible thing. She did not kiss Cora goodbye. She did not ask me to call if the baby cried too much. She did not turn around. Through the front window, I watched her place the suitcase into the trunk of her car. The taillights glowed red against the dirty snow, then disappeared toward the main road. The house became quiet except for Cora. I stood near the door long after Celeste had gone, holding a child I had never expected to bring home because she was already in my home, left there by the woman who had given birth to her 4 days earlier. The first hour after that was not beautiful. I wish I could tell you some maternal instinct descended over me and made everything obvious. It did not. I was terrified. I reread the discharge instructions 3 times, because I could not remember when Cora had last eaten. I searched through the diaper bag and found fewer supplies than I expected. I called the pediatric nurse line because Cora made a sound while breathing that frightened me, only to learn it was normal newborn congestion. I warmed formula, then worried it was too warm. I checked the instructions again. I changed a diaper badly enough that I had to change her clothes afterward, too. At midnight, I realized I had not eaten dinner. At 2 a.m, Cora cried even though she had been fed and changed. At 3, she finally slept against my chest while I sat upright on the couch, afraid to shift my weight. I looked at her hospital bracelet in the blue light from the television screen. I had never turned off. 4 days. She had been alive for 4 days. I had spent 33 years learning how to take care of myself, and suddenly another human being needed something from me every few minutes. That night stripped motherhood of every romantic image I had carried through the years I wanted it. There were no nursery photographs, no carefully prepared bassinet, no shower gifts stacked in a corner. There was one borrowed blanket, a half-packed diaper bag, paperwork scattered across my dining table, and a woman too frightened to close her eyes because she was responsible for keeping a newborn safe until morning. By sunrise, I had learned exactly one thing. Wanting a child and being responsible for one were not remotely the same experience. Cora woke hungry just after 6. While I fed her, Dawn turned the living room windows pale gray, her fingers wrapped around one of mine without intention. The grip was weak, reflexive, nothing like the sentimental gesture adults like to imagine babies make. Still, I did not move my hand. The house looked different in daylight. The carrier sat near the sofa where Celeste had left it, one strap twisted beneath the blanket. Bottles and papers had spread across surfaces that had been orderly the day before. I could see exactly how unprepared I was, but I could also see the first list of things that could be done. Feed Cora, call the doctor, call work, call the lawyer, find out what authority the paper actually gave me. Terror became slightly more manageable when it could be broken into tasks. I wrote the tasks on the back of an unopened utility bill because it was the first paper within reach. The list was crooked and incomplete, but it kept me moving. Every item I crossed out left Cora exactly as dependent on me as before. It simply made the next 10 minutes possible. That was the scale on which I learned to think that first morning. When the pediatrician's office opened, I called to explain enough of the situation to arrange follow-up care under the temporary authorization. After that, I contacted my supervisor and asked for emergency leave. The explanation I gave was short. My sister had left her newborn with me, and I did not yet know for how long. Then, I called the attorney whose card Celeste had left on my table. His assistant transferred me after I gave my name. The lawyer did not dramatize anything. He confirmed that the document in my possession was only temporary authority for immediate care and medical decisions. It did not make me Cora's legal parent, and it certainly was not an adoption. If Celeste intended anything more permanent, proper legal steps would be required. I remember feeling relieved when he said that. Temporary. For a few seconds, I still wanted to believe that word described the night before. Then he began explaining why Celeste had contacted him. I shifted Cora higher against my shoulder and looked at the suitcase-shaped empty space beside my front door where my sister had been standing 12 hours earlier. The lawyer told me Celeste had not asked him to prepare documents for a few days of childcare. She had asked him what would be required if she did not intend to resume raising her daughter at all. And that was when I understood the papers on my dining table were not the beginning of my sister's panic. They were the beginning of her plan. The lawyer's words did not change the room around me. Morning light still lay across the dining table. Cora still slept against my shoulder. Celeste's temporary care authorization still sat beneath the attorney's business card. Yet everything had shifted, because the word temporary no longer belonged to my sister's intentions. It belonged only to the legal arrangement, holding Cora's life together, until someone could decide what came next. The attorney explained the immediate steps in plain terms. The paper Celeste had left allowed me to consent to routine medical care for the moment, but it did not make me Cora's parent, and could not simply become an adoption because 2 sisters had agreed to it. If Celeste truly meant what she had told him, there would be formal notices, court filings, and time for the legal rights of both biological parents to be addressed. Until then, my job was narrower and somehow more frightening. Keep the baby safe, document what I was doing, follow the pediatrician's instructions, and let the process move at the speed the law required. I wrote the important parts on the back of an envelope, because my mind kept dropping sentences as soon as I heard them. At one point, I realized I had been tracing the same word with my pen while staring at Cora's sleeping face. Permanent. I crossed it out. Nothing was permanent yet. The rest of that first week blurred into the smallest units of time I had ever lived. 2 hours until the next feeding. 20 minutes until a bottle cooled. 10 minutes spent searching for a clean burp cloth, only to discover one tucked beneath my own elbow. I learned that newborns could make alarming noises while completely healthy. I learned that sleep came in fragments too short to feel like sleep. I learned how quickly laundry multiplied when a person weighed less than 8 pounds. My house changed before I did. A bassinet appeared beside my bed after a coworker quietly left one on my porch. Bottles lined my drying rack. A stack of diapers occupied the shelf where I used to keep magazines. I cleared an entire drawer in my dresser because Cora owned almost nothing beyond what Celeste had packed into one bag. There was no nursery waiting for her. That bothered me more than I expected. For years, I had tried not to build imaginary rooms for children I might never have. When the fertility treatments failed, I had stopped letting myself picture cribs, paint colors, or tiny clothes hanging in a closet. It had been one of the ways I learned to survive disappointment without reopening it every morning. Now, a baby slept 3 feet from me, and I still had no idea whether she would be there in 6 months, so I did not decorate. I bought only what she needed next. That was how I protected myself in those early weeks, one size of diapers at a time. The practical costs arrived in the same incremental way. Formula disappeared faster than I expected. Doctor copays, bottles, laundry detergent, a car seat base for my own car, and the small pharmacy purchases that come with a newborn began showing up on receipts. I tucked into a kitchen drawer. I was not poor, Chase, but I was a community college employee living on one salary, and suddenly every ordinary purchase had another person attached to it. I started cooking at home more often, and postponed replacing a refrigerator that had been making an ominous clicking sound for months. None of those choices felt like sacrifice in the dramatic sense. They were simply the arithmetic of making room for Cora. Returning to work made the arrangement feel real in another way. During my first shortened day back, I left Cora with a licensed infant care provider recommended through a colleague. I stood beside the crib longer than necessary, checking that the emergency contact sheet had my number in 3 different places. On campus, I spent the morning helping students solve registration problems, while part of my attention stayed several miles away. When the caregiver sent a photograph of Cora sleeping with one fist beside her face, I opened it between appointments and felt relief so immediate that I had to close my office door for a minute. By the end of the week, I understood that caring for her would not remain inside my house. It would follow me into schedules, budgets, work decisions, and every plan that now required me to imagine what she needed too. The physical work of caring for Cora made it easy to postpone every larger question. I returned forms. I spoke with the attorney. I scheduled pediatric appointments. My supervisor rearranged my workload so I could use leave and then come back gradually. Nothing about it felt heroic. It felt expensive, inconvenient, exhausting, and completely ordinary in the way real responsibility usually does. There were nights when Cora cried long enough that I carried her through every room in the house, because sitting still made me feel trapped inside the sound. There were mornings when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman with unwashed hair and a formula stain on her shirt. Once, after almost no sleep, I sat on the kitchen floor because I had dropped a clean bottle and could not summon the energy to pick it up. Cora started crying from the other room. For one shameful second, I closed my eyes. Not because I wanted to leave her, because I understood how relentlessly a baby could need someone. The difference between Celeste and me was not that I never felt overwhelmed. The difference was that I stood up. By the time Cora was a few weeks old, the legal arrangement had become stable enough that I could stop worrying that a receptionist at a doctor's office would refuse to let me authorize care. My attorney handled most of the procedural pieces without turning them into something larger than they were. Temporary authority was put on firmer footing while the longer process began. The biological father was formally notified through counsel. He did not seek custody and did not attempt to step into Cora's daily life. The necessary legal questions around his rights would take time to resolve, but there was no second household waiting for her. There was mine. I tried not to think of it that way too soon. The hardest part was that permanence and uncertainty had to coexist. I could not tell the pediatrician that Cora was definitely staying forever, but I still had to know when her next vaccinations were due. I could not promise myself what the court would eventually decide, but I had to arrange childcare for the following month. Each practical decision pulled me farther into a future I was still afraid to name. At night, when the house finally went quiet, I sometimes opened the calendar on my refrigerator and saw how completely another person had entered it. Pediatric appointment, return to work date, attorney call, formula order. Nothing on the page looked sentimental. Together, they were the outline of a life reorganizing itself around a child. Celeste did not call during the first week. Then the second. I told myself she was recovering from childbirth and dealing with the move. I imagined she might be sleeping at odd hours, meeting with doctors, handling paperwork, arranging an apartment. I constructed generous explanations because they cost me less than the obvious one. At Cora's 1-month pediatric appointment, I found myself watching my phone in the waiting room. No message came. At 6 weeks, I stopped checking. That was the first time Celeste's silence changed shape. Until then, it had felt like absence. After that, it began to feel like intention. I saw her name once in a company announcement forwarded by someone who did not know what had happened. Hartwell had welcomed her into the New York strategy group. The photograph showed Celeste standing in a conference room in a dark suit, her expression composed, her body turned slightly away from the camera. The article praised her discipline and ability to execute difficult transitions. Cora was asleep across my lap when I read it. I closed the email without finishing. I did not resent Celeste for going back to work. I resented the ease with which the public version of her life had absorbed the previous month without leaving a visible mark. Mine had been rearranged down to the furniture. Hers looked exactly as she had planned it. The first ordinary medical scare came when Cora was almost 3 months old. She developed a fever late one evening and became unusually quiet. It was not a dramatic emergency. The pediatrician's after-hours line walked me through the temperature, feeding, wet diapers, and warning signs. They told me when to bring her in and what to watch. I understood every instruction. My hands still shook when I wrote them down. The fever climbed enough that I took her to an urgent pediatric clinic. I remember the fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant, and Cora's hot cheek against my neck while we waited. I remember staring at the little plastic bracelet they placed around her wrist and thinking of the hospital bracelet I had tucked into the adoption file at home. The doctor was reassuring. A common virus. Fluids. Monitoring. Follow-up. Nothing extraordinary. That was what made the night important. There was no crisis large enough to transform me. No dramatic moment where a doctor declared that I had saved her. I simply sat beside Cora for hours, checking her breathing and changing damp clothes when the fever finally broke. Around 4 a.m, she opened her eyes. I touched 2 fingers to her forehead and felt that the heat had eased. Relief moved through me so suddenly I had to sit back. For months I had been careful about what word I used for myself, as if language might tempt fate. I was her aunt, her caregiver, the person with temporary authority, the one handling things until the court decided what was legally possible. But sitting beside that crib, exhausted and afraid to sleep, none of those words were large enough. I did not say anything aloud. I just stayed there until morning. The adoption question came several months later, after enough legal pieces had been resolved for my attorney to explain what permanence would actually require. He did not pressure me. He simply asked whether, if Celeste continued with her decision and the remaining legal requirements were satisfied, I wanted to petition to adopt Cora. I had expected relief. Instead, fear arrived first. Until that moment, I had still kept a small emergency exit open in my mind. I could tell myself I was doing the right thing for now. I could love Cora without admitting how much there was to lose, because the arrangement still belonged partly to circumstance. Adoption would change that. It would not make me more responsible for Cora than I already felt, but it would force me to stop pretending my attachment was temporary. That night, after putting her to bed, I sat at the dining table where Celeste had left the papers months earlier. The temporary authorization was still in the file. I ran my thumb over the date. 4 days old. I thought about every moment since then in which I had waited for someone else to decide what Cora's life would become. Celeste had already decided. Her biological father had decided not to seek a place in it. The only person still pretending not to have made a choice was me. The next morning, I called my attorney and told him I wanted to move forward. The formal process took time. There were filings, notices, reviews, and questions that belonged more to the court than to the emotional story happening inside my house. I answered what I was asked. I provided the records I had kept. I let the lawyers handle what they were trained to handle. Cora kept growing while adults moved paper. She learned to roll over before the final hearing. She developed an obsession with the ceiling fan in my bedroom. She laughed for the first time while I was folding a towel and making a ridiculous noise without realizing anyone was listening. By then, my house no longer looked borrowed from my old life. A crib stood where a reading chair used to be. Plastic toys appeared beneath the coffee table. There were photographs on the refrigerator. I had stopped buying diapers, one package at a time. When the adoption was finalized later that year, there was no cinematic feeling of one life ending and another beginning. Cora had already been my daughter in every way that shaped my days. The court only made the outside world match what had quietly become true inside our home. I remember more about the drive home than I do about the legal formalities. Cora was strapped into the back seat, kicking one sock halfway off while I waited at a red light. The certified papers sat in a folder on the passenger seat. For months, every official form had required me to explain who I was and what authority I had. That afternoon, the explanation finally shortened. I was her mother. At home, I put the folder on the table and made lunch. Cora smeared mashed banana across the tray of her high chair and laughed when I tried to wipe it from her wrist. The moment refused to become ceremonial. That was fitting. The family we had built had never depended on one dramatic declaration. It had formed through feedings, appointments, work schedules, small fears, and the accumulation of mornings in which Cora woke up and found the same person there. That evening, after she was asleep, I filled out one more medical form and reached the line marked relationship to patient. For months I had written aunt, guardian, temporary caregiver, or whatever wording the document required. This time I wrote mother, and did not have to explain the word in the margin. The change was tiny enough to fit inside one blank on a form, but I sat with the pen in my hand for several seconds before moving on. I chose to keep Whitaker as her surname, not to erase Celeste, not to pretend blood had vanished. I wanted Cora to carry the name of the home where someone would answer when she cried in the middle of the night. Afterward, my attorney gave me the records I would need to preserve: the hospital paperwork, the temporary care authorization, the final adoption documents, information connected to her biological parents that Cora might have a right or need to understand later. The hospital bracelet was there too. I held it between my fingers, surprised by how small it looked now. The date printed on it belonged to a version of Cora she would never remember and a version of me I could barely recognize. I put everything into a document box and slid it onto the highest shelf in my bedroom closet. I did not hide it because I planned to lie to her. I told myself I was preserving it until she was old enough to ask the right questions. At the time, I did not understand that children rarely wait until adults decide a question is safe. Years passed the way they often do when you are busy raising someone slowly in the middle and impossibly fast in memory. Cora learned to walk, holding onto the edge of my sofa. She called me Mom before she understood what the word could mean biologically. She scraped her knees, lost teeth, developed favorite foods, changed her mind about favorite colors, and once cried for an hour because a worm dried out on the sidewalk before she could move it back into the grass. I did not raise her in a house where adoption was a forbidden word. She knew from early on that I had not carried her in my body. She knew I was also her aunt by birth. I used simple explanations when she was small and added detail only when she seemed ready for it. For years, that was enough. Then, when she was 6, Her first-grade teacher sent home a family tree assignment. The paper had empty branches with spaces for parents, grandparents, and relatives. Cora worked on it at the kitchen table with colored pencils scattered around her elbows. She put my name where she believed it belonged without hesitation. Then she stopped. Her pencil hovered over another blank. I was rinsing dishes when she asked about the woman who had given birth to her. There was nothing dramatic in her voice, just curiosity. I dried my hands slowly and sat across from her. She looked down at the family tree, not at me. Then she tapped the empty branch with the eraser of her pencil. Where does the woman who had me go? And for the first time since Celeste left that January night, I understood that loving Cora would eventually require more than staying. One day, I would have to tell her why someone else had gone. When Cora asked where the woman who had given birth to her belonged on the family tree, I remember looking at the blank branch longer than I looked at my daughter. At 6, she still drew people with round heads and straight arms. She had written my name in purple, because purple was her favorite color that month, and she had added a crooked heart beside it. The empty space beneath her pencil did not look threatening. It was just one more branch on a worksheet meant to teach children that families had shapes. Mine simply had a shape the worksheet had not anticipated. I told her that Celeste was the woman who gave birth to her, and that I was Celeste's sister. I reminded her that I had adopted her when she was a baby, something Cora already knew in the uncomplicated way young children can know facts without carrying all their weight. I explained that Celeste had not been ready to be a mother, and that I had become the person who raised her. Cora accepted that answer more easily than I did. She wrote Celeste's first name in a smaller space, off to the side, studied the page for a moment, then asked whether she could draw another branch because I was both her mom and her aunt. That mattered more to her than anything else that afternoon. I found myself breathing again. For a while, questions about Celeste came like weather brief, unpredictable, never staying long enough to become a storm. Cora wanted to know whether she had gotten her hair from her, whether Celeste had liked pancakes, whether we had shared a bedroom when we were girls. Those were easy enough to answer, because they belonged to ordinary history. I could tell Cora that Celeste had always hated waking up early, that she used to alphabetize her school notes, that she once refused to wear the same dress twice in school pictures. I was careful about what I left out. I told myself careful was the same thing as honest. By the time Cora was 8, she understood enough about adoption to know that another woman had once made a decision that placed her in my home permanently. What she did not understand was why. One evening, she was brushing the hair of a doll on the living room floor while I sorted mail. She had been unusually quiet after school. Earlier that week, a classmate had asked why her mom was also her aunt. Children do not always intend cruelty when they ask direct questions. Sometimes curiosity is simply sharp because it has not yet learned where adults place cushions. Cora kept brushing the same section of synthetic hair until it began to frizz. Then she asked me whether she had cried too much as a baby. The question seemed small enough that I almost answered it casually. I told her all babies cried. She looked at the doll instead of me. A minute later, she asked whether she had been a bad baby. The stack of envelopes in my hands stopped moving. There are moments when a parent suddenly sees the machinery behind a child's thought, all the gears that had been turning unseen. Until that evening, I had believed Cora understood the simple version I had given her. Celeste was not ready. I was, and our family had grown from there. But children are not comfortable with empty spaces. If an adult does not fill them, a child often will. And Cora had begun filling hers with herself. I put the mail down and sat on the carpet beside her. I told her there was nothing a 4-day-old baby could do to make an adult's life go wrong. Nothing about crying, feeding, sleeping, or needing care could make a baby responsible for what happened next. She still would not look at me. So I gave her the simplest truth I had. Children are never responsible for the choices adults are too afraid to own. The words were probably larger than the language I usually used with her, but the meaning was simple enough. I told her the problem had never been anything she did. At 4 days old, She had not even been old enough to know there was a problem to solve. Cora leaned against my arm after that. She did not ask anything else. I mistook the silence for reassurance. What I did not understand yet was that the question would not disappear simply because I had answered it once. It changed shape instead. By 9, Cora had become the child teachers described as unusually mature. She remembered homework without being reminded. She returned permission slips early. She packed her backpack at night and laid out clothes before bed. At school conferences, I heard the same phrases often enough that I began to accept them without examining what they meant. Responsible, independent, easy. I was proud of her. That pride delayed my understanding. There was no single moment when Cora decided she needed to be good enough to keep. The belief grew quietly in the habits adults praised. She did not ask for help if she could avoid it. If she spilled something, she cleaned it before telling me. If she felt sick, she waited until the discomfort became impossible to hide. When I spent money on something for her, even something ordinary like new shoes, she wanted to know whether they were too expensive. She apologized for taking up space in ways no child should have noticed. I began seeing it in places that had nothing to do with school. If a friend came over and ate the last snack, Cora told me she had not wanted it anyway. If her shoes pinched, she kept wearing them, until I noticed the red mark on her heel. At a birthday party, another child accidentally tore a paper decoration Cora had helped make, and Cora apologized to the host before the child who tore it did. She was learning to absorb inconvenience before anyone could assign it to her. What made the pattern easy to miss was how often adults rewarded it. Teachers called her dependable. Other parents told me how polite she was. I heard compliments that would have made any mother proud, and slowly began noticing the tension underneath them. Cora was not simply conscientious. She was watching rooms. She noticed who was tired, who was irritated, what might need cleaning, whether asking for something would create extra work. The skill made her seem older than she was. It also meant she was practicing, every day, how to need less. At the time, I often told myself it was simply her personality. Then came the science project. Cora was 10, almost 11, and had spent 2 weeks building a model water filtration system for school. She worked at the kitchen table each evening, measuring sand and gravel, labeling plastic bottles, refusing help unless she could not open something. The project was good, but the morning she had to present it, part of the structure collapsed in her backpack. She tried to repair it at school. It failed during the demonstration. Her teacher gave her a much lower score than she expected. None of that was extraordinary. Children fail at things every day. The strange part came afterward. Cora did not show me the grade. For nearly a week, she kept the paper folded inside the back cover of a notebook. I found it accidentally, while looking for a school form she said she had misplaced. The project score was written in red across the top. What caught my attention was not the number. It was the crease running through the paper from how many times she had folded it smaller. When Cora came home that afternoon, she saw the page on the kitchen table and froze before taking off her coat. Her first reaction was not embarrassment. It was fear. Her eyes moved from the paper to my face. She immediately started explaining that the model had worked at home, that she had tried to fix it, that she would redo the research even though the teacher had not asked her to. The words came too fast, tripping over each other. Then she said something that made every small behavior from the previous years line up in my mind. "I'll do better. I promise I won't be difficult." I remember the cold from outside still clinging to her coat. Her backpack hung from one shoulder. She looked like a child waiting for a sentence. I could have told her the grade did not matter. I could have reassured her that one bad project would not change anything. Instead, I asked why she thought failing made her difficult. Cora immediately withdrew from the question. She claimed she did not mean it that way and reached for the paper as if she could end the conversation by putting it away. I did not force her to explain something she probably could not yet explain to herself. That evening, I took the damaged model out of the box where she had hidden it. One side had come loose. The plastic bottle was scratched. A handwritten label had peeled halfway off. We sat together and rebuilt it. Not because she needed to resubmit it, because I wanted her to experience failure without the room changing around her. I let her be frustrated. I did not rush to make the project prettier than it had been. When she snapped at me because a piece would not hold, I handed her the tape and waited. When she became tired and said she wanted to quit, I packed everything into the box instead of turning it into a lesson about persistence. Before she went upstairs, I stopped her. "You don't have to be easy to love for me to love you." She stared at me for a second. Then her face changed in a way I still remember. Not dramatically. Her mouth tightened first, and she looked down at her socks. I did not make her answer. Some sentences need somewhere quiet to land. The next morning, the bad grade was still the same. So was breakfast. So was the ride to school. So was home when she returned. That was the lesson I wanted her body to learn, even if her mind was not ready to name it. Failure did not make the house disappear. For the next few weeks, I resisted the urge to turn the science project into a family slogan. I did not keep reminding her of the lesson or tell other relatives what she had said. I simply let ordinary life prove the point. She forgot a library book and still came home to dinner. She snapped at me one morning before school and found me waiting at pickup that afternoon. When she asked for help studying for a math test, I sat beside her without treating the request as evidence that she had finally learned something profound. I wanted love to become background noise in her life, not a reward she had to trigger by behaving correctly. For a while, I thought that was enough. As Cora grew older, her questions about Celeste became less frequent but more precise. She stopped asking what Celeste liked and started asking what she had done. Had she ever visited after the adoption? Had she sent birthday cards? Did she know where we lived? The answer to the last question was yes. The legal process had made that impossible to pretend otherwise. But I kept the edges of everything softened. I said Celeste had built a life in New York. I said she had chosen not to be involved. Both statements were true. Neither was complete. The incompleteness followed us into small moments. If Cora saw a mother and daughter arguing in a store, she sometimes watched them longer than necessary, as if conflict itself were evidence that the relationship would survive. When classmates complained about parents who embarrassed them or forgot things, Cora rarely joined in. She was still too aware that having a mother who showed up was something she was not supposed to take lightly. I wanted to tell her she was allowed to be annoyed with me, disappointed in me, even furious with me without becoming ungrateful. But that lesson would have required me to understand how much fear was hiding beneath her good behavior, and I was only beginning to see it. I also began noticing how quickly she tried to pay emotional debts that did not exist. If I drove her to an activity, she offered to carry groceries afterward. If I bought something she needed, she looked for a chore before I asked. I never told her love was a transaction, yet some part of her had started keeping accounts. That was what frightened me most. The possibility that she could feel deeply loved and still believe she needed to keep earning the right to stay. The question I feared came one winter evening, when Cora was 11. She was helping me put groceries away. Without looking up, she asked whether Celeste had ever called to ask about her. I was holding a carton of milk. I remember that because I stood there long enough for cold condensation to collect against my palm. The honest answer was simple. No, not once. But simple answers can carry enormous weight. Instead, I told Cora that Celeste had her own life and had chosen to keep distance after the adoption. It was not a lie. It was also not the answer she had asked for. Cora shut the refrigerator door. She did not press me. That should have relieved me. It did not. For the first time, I saw something in her expression that frightened me more than anger would have. Recognition. She had noticed the gap. After that, the subject of Celeste went quiet for several months. Cora did not ask. I did not volunteer. Our days continued around the silence. School, groceries, laundry, weekend errands, birthday parties, a scraped elbow, a book she insisted on reading under the covers after bedtime. The ordinary life I had always wanted continued to grow around the one subject I was afraid might damage it. At night, sometimes, I would think about the document box in my closet. The hospital bracelet was still inside. So was the temporary care authorization Celeste had signed when Cora was 4 days old. I considered taking the box down several times. Each time I decided Cora was too young. At 11, I told myself 12. At 12, I decided middle school was already hard enough. Then 13 arrived, with its own sharp edges. Changing friendships, changing body, more complicated social rules. The first signs that children could hurt each other deliberately, rather than accidentally. There never seemed to be a perfect age to hand someone proof that her biological mother had looked at her after 4 days and begun arranging to leave. So I postponed it again. My reasoning sounded better each time I repeated it. She knows she is adopted. She knows Celeste chose not to raise her. She knows I love her. What good would the exact details do now? I never asked the other question. What harm could the missing details already be doing? By 13, Cora was tall enough to reach most of the shelves in my closet. She no longer needed me to find things for school projects or seasonal clothes. She had begun borrowing old scarves and jackets from boxes I had not opened in years. One rainy Saturday, she was looking for a folder of photographs for a history assignment. I had told her there were old family pictures in the bedroom closet, and that she could take whatever she needed. I was downstairs paying bills. At some point I noticed the house had become too quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the suspended kind. I called upstairs that dinner would be ready soon. Cora did not answer. I found her sitting on the floor inside my bedroom, surrounded by open boxes. The photograph folder lay beside her. So did the adoption file. For half a second, I thought only about privacy. Then I saw what she was holding. The hospital bracelet rested across her palm. Beside her knee was the temporary care authorization Celeste had signed 13 years earlier, when Cora was 4 days old. Cora had placed the bracelet against the printed date on the document. Her eyes moved between them. She did not look confused. She looked like someone checking math she desperately wanted to be wrong. I stopped in the doorway. The rain tapped softly against the bedroom window. Cora lifted the paper. Her voice was quiet. "This says 4 days after I was born." I did not move. Every version of the truth I had postponed sat between us now, in black ink. She looked at the bracelet again, then back at me. For years, I had told myself I was waiting until she was old enough to understand. Standing there, I finally understood the flaw in that plan. I had assumed I would be the one who decided when the truth arrived. Cora had just found it without me. Cora kept the temporary care authorization in both hands, as if the paper might change if she stared at it long enough. The hospital bracelet lay across her knee, its faded print still showing the date of her birth. The authorization carried a date 4 days later. There was no complicated math to protect me now, no softer wording left between those two objects. Rain ticked against the bedroom window. Somewhere downstairs, the dishwasher changed cycles with a low mechanical hum. I remember those ordinary sounds, because neither of us moved for several seconds. Cora read the date again. Then she looked at me. Until that afternoon, the story I had given her had been true in the way a photograph cropped too tightly can still be true. Celeste had not been ready to be a mother. I had raised Cora. The adoption had become permanent. None of that was false. I had simply kept everything outside the frame. Cora asked whether Celeste had left when she was 4 days old. There was no decent way to soften the answer anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed and told her yes. Her face did not crumple. That would almost have been easier. She placed the paper beside the bracelet with strange care, aligning the edges as if order on the carpet could compensate for what had just broken inside the room. Then she wanted to know why. I had imagined this conversation many times over the years. In those imaginary versions, I was calm and wise. I chose perfect words. Cora understood that adults could make painful decisions without those decisions defining the child they hurt. She cried, perhaps, and I held her, and truth somehow made us closer. Real life gave me no such mercy. I told her about Hartwell, about the New York position, about how Celeste had arrived with a suitcase, already having spoken to an attorney. I explained that I had offered to help with childcare, to give her time to recover, even to help her manage the transition without giving up motherhood altogether. Cora listened without interrupting. That frightened me more than anger. When I reached the part I had spent 13 years avoiding, my mouth went dry. I could have paraphrased it. For one last second, I considered doing exactly that. Then I understood that if I softened the truth again, even now, I would be choosing my comfort over hers. So I told her the exact sentence. You've cried about being infertile for years. Consider her my gift to you. Cora did not react immediately. Her fingers moved to the bracelet again. She slid it over 2 fingers, then took it off, as if the plastic suddenly felt contaminated by the memory attached to it. I watched her eyes travel toward the closet where the document box had been sitting all those years. There are insults that hurt because they are cruel. Others hurt because they reorganize a person's entire understanding of the past. That one did both. Cora had grown up knowing she was adopted. She had never believed I gave birth to her, never been ambushed by the existence of another mother. But until that afternoon, she had believed the separation came from something vague and adult unreadiness, instability, circumstances too complicated for a child to understand. Now she knew there had been a suitcase, a promotion, a decision prepared in advance, and a sentence that turned her into something one woman could hand another. I tried to explain why I had withheld it. The words sounded weak the moment they left me. I told her I had wanted her childhood to belong to her, rather than to the worst thing Celeste ever said. I said I had been afraid that a little girl would hear, "She left for a promotion," and turn it into, "I was less important than a job." I admitted that every year I had planned to tell her when she was older, and every year older had brought another reason to wait. Cora finally looked at me. You let me spend years wondering what I did wrong when you knew exactly what happened. The sentence landed without volume. I had no defense that did not make the mistake worse. She was right. By trying to protect her from one specific wound, I had left her alone with an unnamed one. She had filled the silence with crying too much, needing too much, failing too much, being difficult. I had watched the consequences appear in her life, without recognizing that some of them had grown inside the space I was protecting. I lowered my eyes to my hands. I thought protecting you from the truth was the same as protecting you from pain. I was wrong. That was all I gave her. No excuse afterward. No reminder that I had fed her at 3 a.m, or sat beside her during fevers, or signed every report card. Those things were true, but they did not erase this mistake. Love did not make me incapable of hurting her. If anything, the fact that she trusted me made the hurt sharper. Cora picked up the authorization and returned it to the box. She left the bracelet on the floor, then she walked past me. For the rest of that day, the house seemed to hold its breath. She did not slam doors. She did not shout from the staircase. She simply stopped bringing herself into rooms where I was. At dinner, she said she was not hungry. The next morning, she was dressed before I came downstairs. She left for school with her backpack over one shoulder and a distance in her face I had never seen before. That distance became the beginning of everything that followed. For several days, even the physical geography of the house changed. Cora took homework upstairs, instead of spreading it across the kitchen table. She showered later so our routines would not overlap. When I came into a room, she found a reason to finish what she was doing somewhere else. None of those choices was dramatic enough to confront on its own, but together they made the house feel divided by a line I could not see. I kept wanting to repair it with one perfect conversation. Each time I approached her too quickly, her shoulders tightened before I even spoke. That reaction taught me something I was not yet ready to accept. An apology can be sincere and still fail to restore trust on demand. Cora needed time to decide what my apology meant. I could not make that decision for her either. So I began leaving room instead of speeches. I kept dinner warm when she ate later than I did. I knocked before entering her room. When she gave me one-word answers, I stopped chasing a better response through 3 more questions. Those choices did not fix us, but they removed some of the pressure I had created by treating reconciliation like another outcome I could manage. The difficulty was that every quiet concession felt, to the frightened part of me, like losing ground. I had to learn that giving Cora space was not the same as surrendering the relationship. Some evenings the best I could do was leave a plate covered on the stove and go upstairs without asking whether she planned to eat. When I came down later, the plate would be in the sink. It was not reconciliation, but it was contact, a quiet sign that she still expected care to be there, even while she was angry with the person providing it. At 13, anger rarely arrives alone. It pulls embarrassment, curiosity, pride, humiliation, and the new hunger for independence behind it. Cora had already been standing at the edge of adolescence. The truth about Celeste did not create every conflict that came next, but it gave all of them a language. Everyone keeps deciding for me. She never said that exact sentence at first. She lived it instead. The first changes were small enough to dismiss. She stopped telling me which assignments were due. She began answering questions with the minimum amount of information necessary. She turned down rides and walked farther than she needed to, because asking me for anything felt like giving up territory. Tessa Nguyen had been one of her school friends for more than a year by then. I knew her mostly as the girl whose sneakers were always untied and who once left an entire lunchbox at our house for 3 days without noticing. She was easygoing where Cora was careful, the kind of child who could forget a homework assignment, apologize, and move on without treating the mistake as evidence about her character. Tessa came over a few times during those first weeks after the discovery. I noticed Cora was lighter around her. Not happier exactly, but less guarded. Tessa did not know the details of our family history. She only knew Cora and I were fighting more than usual. I was grateful Cora still had someone she talked to. Then I began worrying that talking to anyone but me meant I was losing her. Fear has a way of turning ordinary things into evidence. If Cora shut her bedroom door, I saw rejection. If she stayed after school without reminding me, I saw secrecy. If she asked to go somewhere with friends, I wondered whether she was trying to build a life that did not include me. I had spent years telling myself biology could not erase what we had built. Now, for the first time, I was facing a different possibility. Maybe biology did not need to take Cora away. Maybe my own mistake could push her away instead. The first curfew violation was only 20 minutes. She claimed she had lost track of time walking home with friends. I believed that was possible. I also knew the old Cora would have called. The second time was nearly an hour. Her phone worked perfectly. She simply did not answer. I responded by tightening the rules. Earlier curfew. More check-ins. Fewer unsupervised plans. I told myself structure would restore stability. What it restored was resistance. Cora began testing every boundary I set, sometimes for no reason I could understand beyond the fact that I had set it. She skipped an after-school study period. She stopped turning in one class assignment on time. Her grades did not collapse, but the precision that had always defined her started fraying at the edges. Part of me knew this might simply be adolescence. Another part of me saw Celeste in every act of defiance. That was unfair to Cora. It was also unfair to Celeste in a different way, because it allowed me to blame my sister for decisions my daughter was now making herself. At the time, I was too frightened to separate those truths cleanly. One afternoon, the school notified me that Cora had missed her last class. She had not left campus entirely. She and two other students had gone to a coffee shop across the street and returned before dismissal. It was not a catastrophe. I reacted as if it were evidence of one. I took away her phone for the weekend and told her she would go directly from school to home for the next 2 weeks. Cora listened with her jaw clenched. She did not argue until I said I could no longer trust her judgment. Then, the entire conflict changed. She told me I had never trusted her with the truth either. The accuracy of it made me defensive. I reminded her that withholding something painful at 8 was not the same as skipping class at 13. I said parents were supposed to make decisions children were not ready to make. The sentence sounded reasonable until I saw what it did to her face. To Cora, it was simply another version of the same rule. Adults decide. Cora lives with it. She went upstairs before I finished. I stood alone in the kitchen with her phone in my hand and began to understand that punishment without repaired trust was only producing obedience where I could see it. Everywhere else, she was learning to hide. Over the next months, the rebellion widened. Not dramatically. That almost made it more frightening. There was no single terrible act I could point to and say, this is the moment everything went wrong. There were dozens of smaller ones. A lie about whose house she was visiting. A note from school about another missed class. A bedroom window cracked open after I had told her she was grounded. A set of clothes changed in a friend's bathroom because she knew I would disapprove of what she had left the house wearing. Nothing that would destroy a life. Enough to change one. I became a worse version of myself in response. I checked the location on her phone too often. I asked questions whose answers I had already verified. I listened for the front door after bedtime. Twice, I checked that her bedroom window was locked. The second time, I stood with my hand on the latch and felt ashamed. For years I had wanted Cora to know she was safe in my house. Now I was making safety feel like surveillance. But fear rarely gives up control simply because control is failing. Cora felt the difference. She began calling me Mara during arguments. The first time, I pretended not to care. The second time, it cut deeper. Mom had come to me so naturally when she was small that I had almost forgotten there had ever been another possibility. Hearing my first name from her mouth during those months reminded me that motherhood was not a biological fact I could rely on. It was a relationship. Relationships could fracture. One evening, the fracture became visible. Cora had come home late again. I had been waiting at the dining table, the same table where Celeste had placed the attorney's envelope 13 years earlier. By then, I had learned that beginning a conversation, angry rarely improved anything, so I kept my voice low. I told Cora the pattern could not continue. If she wanted more freedom, she had to show she could handle the freedom she already had. Cora dropped her backpack beside the stairs. She accused me of treating her like a little child whenever I became scared. I told her I was responsible for her safety. She said that was exactly what I always used whenever I wanted control. I should have stopped there. Instead, I reminded her that I had been responsible for her safety since she was 4 days old. The words were out before I understood what I had done. I had taken the most painful truth in her life and used it to strengthen my authority. Cora went still. The anger in her face sharpened. You're not my mother just because she didn't want me. There are sentences you hear first with your body. My hand tightened against the edge of the table. I did not answer. Cora's eyes changed almost immediately. She knew what she had done. I could see it in the brief flicker of regret before pride covered it. But she did not take the words back. She went upstairs and shut the door. I remained at the table. The room looked almost exactly as it had the night Celeste left. Same window, same wall, same floor beneath my feet. For 13 years, I had believed the great threat to my motherhood was the woman who walked out. That night, I began to understand the greater test might be what happened, when the daughter I had raised became angry enough to push me away. I did not sleep much. By morning, fear had hardened into a plan. I tightened the rules again. No going out, without confirmed supervision. Directly home after school. Phone on and answered. No last-minute changes. I framed everything as temporary, until trust improved. Cora heard only the cage closing. Our house turned into a place of inspections and evasions. I checked. She concealed. I questioned. She gave me less. The more afraid I became of losing her, the harder I tried to hold her still. And the harder I held, the more she pulled. The winter evening, when that pattern finally broke, began almost normally. Cora told me she was going to Tessa's after school. I knew Tessa's mother and had no reason to object. I reminded her of the time she needed to be home. She left without arguing. At 6:30, I texted because dinner was nearly ready. No response. At 7, I called. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I told myself the battery had died. At 7:15, I called Tessa's mother. The answer emptied the room around me. Cora had never gone to Tessa's house. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, while the clock above the stove moved another minute forward. For all the nights I had imagined Celeste returning and taking my daughter from me, I had never prepared for this. Cora was 13 years old, her phone was off, and for the first time since she had been placed at my feet as a newborn, I had no idea where my daughter was. I almost drove to Tessa's house, even though her mother had already confirmed Cora had never arrived. Fear kept trying to send me back toward facts I had already checked, as if repeating them might produce a different answer. Instead, I called once more from the car. Tessa knew Cora had been talking to a few older students lately, mostly kids she had met through school friends, but she did not know where they had gone that night. For the next hour, I moved through every place I could connect to my daughter. The coffee shop near school, the small shopping center where students gathered after classes, the park. Even though the temperature had dropped enough that the benches were empty, I called 2 parents whose numbers I had. Neither had seen her. I kept looking at the passenger seat, as if Cora might suddenly appear there simply because that was where she belonged. Every red light felt offensive. Every car moving below the speed limit felt personal. My mind tried to create disasters faster than I could reject them. An accident. A stranger. A car driven by someone too young or too careless. I forced myself back to what I actually knew. She had left school. She had lied about going to Tessa's. Her phone was off. She had been pushing boundaries for months, but she had never disappeared overnight. Not knowing was worse than almost any fact. At one point, I pulled into a gas station because I had driven past the same intersection twice, without remembering which direction I had meant to go. I sat beneath the white canopy lights and realized I had become exactly the kind of mother Cora had been resisting. Frantic, controlling, trying to solve uncertainty by tightening my grip on everything around me. But that insight did not make me less afraid. I checked my phone again. Nothing. What I learned later about that evening was much less dramatic than the possibilities I had invented. Cora had gone with a handful of students to a small gathering at the home of an older teenager whose parents were away for several hours. To 13-year-old Cora, the absence of supervision had looked like freedom. No one asking where she was. No one checking the time. No one deciding what she was ready to know or where she was allowed to go. For a few hours, that felt powerful. Then the evening stopped being easy. More teenagers arrived. Plans shifted. Someone wanted everyone out before a parent came home earlier than expected. The older kids, who had seemed so relaxed when Cora was simply another person in the room, became much less interested in solving the problem of a 13-year-old who had lied about where she was and had no safe ride home. No one attacked her. No one threatened her. They simply stopped feeling responsible for her. That distinction mattered. Cora would tell me much later that the moment frightened her because it was so ordinary. Nobody announced that they were abandoning her. People just began leaving. One person had a ride. Another had somewhere else to sleep. Someone else said she should call whoever usually picked her up. Freedom had lasted exactly as long as Cora remained convenient. By then, she had turned her phone back on. The battery was nearly dead, and my missed calls filled the screen. She did not call immediately. That detail hurt when she eventually admitted it, but I understood it better than she expected. Calling me meant walking back toward everything she had been fighting: the rules, the questions, the truth she believed I had stolen from her. She walked several blocks alone instead. Eventually, she ended up beneath the harsh lights of a 24-hour diner near a bus stop, sitting in a vinyl booth with a glass of water she was too nervous to drink. I was 20 minutes away when my phone rang. Her name appeared on the dashboard. The relief was so violent that for a second I could not make my fingers work properly. Cora did not offer a story. She gave me the name of the diner and said she needed a ride. That was enough. I reached the parking lot a little after 9. Through the front windows, I saw her before she saw me. She was sitting near the door, with her coat zipped to her chin, both hands around her phone. She looked very young. That image remained sharper than any of the arguments that came before it. For months, I had seen defiance whenever I looked at Cora, the child who challenged rules, the girl who could find the precise sentence most likely to hurt me, the person determined to prove she did not need what I gave her. Under those fluorescent lights, I saw my 13-year-old daughter waiting for someone to come. I had brought one of her heavier jackets because I knew the coat she left in that morning was too thin for the temperature. I did not demand an explanation in the diner. I did not ask which children had been there or whether she understood how frightened I had been. Those questions mattered, but they did not matter before getting her home. I handed her the jacket. She put it on without arguing. In the car, silence followed us through the first several intersections. Cora sat turned slightly toward the passenger window. I could see the faint reflection of her face in the glass each time we passed beneath a street lamp. My anger had not disappeared when I found her. Relief had simply become larger. Cora must have sensed both, because halfway home she asked whether I was still mad. I kept my eyes on the road. "I can be angry with you, and still come when you call." That was all I said. Her reflection disappeared as we turned onto a darker road. She did not answer, but her shoulders lowered a little. I wish that drive had repaired us. It did not. Real repair is less satisfying than a dramatic apology, because it takes much longer and rarely announces itself when it begins. Cora still had consequences. She had lied about where she was. She had turned off her phone. She had broken curfew and put herself in a situation where I could not help her because I did not know where she was. For a while, she went straight home after school. Her social freedom narrowed. She had to meet with a counselor about missed class time and make up work she had ignored. The rules were not designed to punish her for being angry with me. They were consequences for choices that had made basic trust impossible. The difference was that I stopped pretending consequences were the same as control. I stopped checking her phone location every 15 minutes. I stopped asking questions when I already knew the answer just to test whether she would lie. I stopped checking her window. Those habits were harder to give up than I expected. Fear had made them feel useful. Without them, I had to rely on something much less certain. Whether the relationship between us could become strong enough for Cora to tell me the truth voluntarily. For the first weeks after that night, we spoke mostly about practical things: school, homework, the conditions under which she would earn back privileges. I did not demand that she forgive me for hiding Celeste's words, simply because I had come to get her from a diner. And I did not let her use my mistake as permission to erase responsibility for her own choices. The real conversation came gradually. It began one evening when we were sorting laundry together, an activity too ordinary to support grand speeches. Cora admitted she had known before leaving school that she was lying to me. She had wanted, for one night, to go somewhere without anyone knowing enough to stop her. She did not blame the older kids. She understood by then that she had followed them because their lack of rules felt like the opposite of my fear. I listened until she finished. Then I told her something I had also been learning about myself. Being hurt explains why we hurt people. It doesn't excuse it. Cora folded one of her shirts twice before putting it into the basket. She knew I was talking about both of us. Her anger at me had been real. So had the cruelty of telling me I was not her mother. My fear of losing her had been real. So had the damage I caused when I let that fear justify secrecy and surveillance. Neither one canceled the other. I apologized again for hiding the truth about Celeste, but that time I did not describe my intentions first. I had spent too long believing good intentions should count more heavily than their consequences. I told Cora I should have trusted that truth could be given gradually, without being withheld indefinitely. I should have answered when she asked whether Celeste ever called. I should not have waited until she found a dated document on her own. Most painfully, I admitted that after she became angry, I had tried to recover certainty by controlling more of her life. That had been fear, wearing the clothes of parenting. Cora did not immediately tell me everything was forgiven. She asked what would happen the next time she wanted to know something I thought might hurt her. The answer I gave was not a promise that I would never hesitate again. I promised I would tell her that I was afraid, instead of quietly deciding for her. That became the beginning of a different relationship. We made rules, but I explained why they existed. Cora could challenge them without every disagreement becoming disobedience. When I did not know an answer, I said so. When something about Celeste was hers to know, I stopped treating the information like a dangerous object only I was qualified to handle. I brought the document box down from the closet. We went through it together. There were no dramatic new secrets inside. That was important. The papers were exactly what they appeared to be. Records from the earliest months of Cora's life. Temporary care authorization, birth information, the later adoption paperwork, and the small hospital bracelet. Cora could look at them whenever she wanted. At first, she looked often, then less. Eventually, the box became boring. That was progress. The truth stopped being a locked room. Trust returned in similarly unremarkable pieces. The first time Cora texted that she was running 10 minutes late without being reminded, I stared at the message longer than necessary. The first time she brought home a disappointing grade and placed it on the counter herself, I did not praise her for honesty so extravagantly that it became another performance. I simply signed what needed signing and asked whether she wanted help. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she did not. Tessa remained part of her life through those months. She did not become Cora's therapist or the wise friend who understood everything. She remained refreshingly ordinary. She forgot things. She complained about school. She came to our house, ate snacks she had not brought, and occasionally asked Cora for help with homework without treating that need as embarrassing. Watching them taught me something I had missed, while praising my daughter's independence. Cora relaxed around people who were comfortable being imperfect. She needed more of that. By 14, the worst of the rebellion had passed, though the consequences of it had not vanished. Cora was still more guarded than she had been as a child. She challenged me more readily. She questioned assumptions. Sometimes she disagreed with me simply because she had discovered she could. I learned not to mistake that for damage. Some of it was growth. The year after our worst conflict, Cora began volunteering at a neighborhood food pantry that partnered with local schools and community groups. It started because she needed service hours, and because Tessa had signed up for one Saturday shift and did not want to go alone. Tessa lasted a few months. Cora stayed. That was where she met Evelyn Carter. Evelyn was in her early 60s, with silver beginning to show in her dark hair and the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years solving problems without needing applause for it. She coordinated volunteers, tracked deliveries, managed shelves, and could locate a missing box of canned tomatoes faster than anyone half her age. Cora liked her immediately. I did too. The pantry gave my daughter a kind of responsibility different from school achievement. People depended on her, but they did not need her to be perfect. If she made a mistake counting inventory, Evelyn corrected it. If she did not know something, someone showed her. Nobody treated competence as a personality. At first, Cora volunteered the way she did everything else. Too hard. She stayed late when no one had asked. She reorganized shelves herself instead of calling another volunteer over. She carried boxes that should have been shared because asking for help still felt like failing some private test. Evelyn noticed. She did not lecture her. One Saturday, I arrived early to pick Cora up and watched through the glass doors while she struggled to shift 2 heavy cartons onto a cart. Evelyn stood nearby with another volunteer and waited. Eventually, Cora put 1 carton down and asked for help. Evelyn handed it to the other volunteer, as naturally as if nothing important had happened. Cora never mentioned that moment. Neither did I. But afterward, I noticed she became slightly less determined to prove she could carry everything alone. Over time, she also became interested in how the pantry operated. Donations came in uneven waves. Some products sat too long while others ran out. Volunteers recorded things differently depending on who was working. Cora began tracking patterns in a spreadsheet because the disorder bothered her. Evelyn let her experiment. The first version was clumsy. The second was better. Eventually, Cora helped build a simple inventory system that made it easier to see what was moving, what was being wasted, and what needed replenishment. It was not revolutionary. It did not make her famous. It solved a small, real problem for people she cared about. That mattered more. By 17, the project had become one of the things she was proudest of because it was useful rather than impressive. Her relationship with Evelyn also gave her something I could not: distance from me. Evelyn had an adult daughter living several states away. They spoke regularly, visited when they could, and seemed completely secure in each other without needing constant proximity. When her daughter missed a holiday because of work, Evelyn did not interpret it as abandonment. When she moved for an opportunity, Evelyn had helped pack the car. I watched that relationship without realizing at first why it stayed with me. My experience of motherhood had begun with a woman leaving a child. For years, part of me had unconsciously treated leaving itself as dangerous. Evelyn seemed to know something I had not yet learned. A child could move away from you without moving out of your love. Cora's high school years were not perfect. Neither were we. We still argued. She still occasionally concealed something, because old habits do not disappear just because people understand where they came from. I still felt the urge to solve problems before she asked me to. The difference was that we had learned how to return. That mattered more than never leaving the path. By the beginning of 2026, Cora was 18 and a high school senior. College applications had turned our dining table into a landscape of forms, deadlines, brochures, and notes. She wanted to study something connected to business analytics and operations, though she had enough sense not to pretend she knew exactly what her life would look like at 30. I was grateful for that uncertainty. It felt healthy. One afternoon in February, she came home carrying her laptop under one arm and dropped her backpack beside the kitchen chair. A counselor had sent her information about a competitive paid summer program for graduating seniors and first-year college students. Cora had already read enough to know the program liked candidates with strong academic records and practical community projects. She opened the page on her laptop and turned it toward me. I saw the logo before I read the name, Hartwell Group. For a moment, the kitchen around me disappeared beneath another room 18 years earlier. An infant carrier on hardwood, a suitcase beside the door, an attorney's card clipped to an envelope. Then I read the title beneath the logo, Hartwell Emerging Leaders Fellowship. Cora was watching my face. And from the way her expression changed, I knew she had already understood exactly why I had gone still. Cora watched me stare at the Hartwell logo until the silence became an answer. The laptop sat between us on the kitchen table, the same table where so many versions of our family had been negotiated over the years. Applications and college brochures were stacked at one end. A mug of coffee I had forgotten to finish sat cooling beside my elbow. Outside, February had left a thin wash of gray over the backyard, the kind of afternoon when everything looked temporarily drained of color. Hartwell Emerging Leaders Fellowship. I read the title again, even though I had understood it the first time. 18 years had passed, since Celeste had walked into my house, talking about Hartwell, as if it were a door she could not afford to let close. The company itself had never harmed Cora. I knew that. Hartwell had not made my sister abandon her daughter. It had offered a promotion. Celeste had made everything that followed. Knowing the distinction did not stop my body from reacting before my judgment caught up. I asked Cora whether her counselor had sent other programs too. She knew exactly what I was doing. There were other fellowships, of course. Programs at universities, nonprofit internships, summer placements with regional companies. I started naming possibilities before I had even checked whether they matched what Cora wanted. My mind was moving faster than hers, building detours. Cora closed the laptop halfway. She did not accuse me of being controlling. She did not need to. We had already lived through that version of ourselves. She reminded me that Hartwell's program fit the work she had been doing with Evelyn. It focused on operations, leadership, data-based problem-solving, and community impact. Participants would spend 10 weeks in New York working on real projects while attending workshops and mentorship sessions. It was paid, it was competitive, and, unlike some of the programs she had found, it was designed to accept graduating high school seniors. Every fact made the program more reasonable. That made me want it less. I asked whether she really wanted to walk into the same company where Celeste had spent 18 years building her career. Cora looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "If I avoid every door because she might be standing behind it, then she's still choosing my life for me." The sentence struck a place in me that had been tender since she was 13. Years earlier, Cora had accused me of deciding too much for her because I was afraid. I had promised I would stop making choices in silence and calling that protection. It was easy to keep that promise when the decisions were small, whether she could see the adoption records, which classes she took, how late she stayed at the pantry. Now fear had arrived wearing a familiar name. Hartwell. Celeste. I looked down at the program description again. The page did not mention my sister. It did not promise special access to executives. It did not say applicants would be personally reviewed by senior leadership in the first round. It was simply an opportunity Cora had earned the right to consider. The truth was uncomfortable because it was simple. I was the one making Hartwell about Celeste. Cora reopened the laptop. "I'm not applying to her. I'm applying to the program." That was the end of the argument. Not because my fear disappeared, because for once I recognized fear, before I turned it into a rule. I told her I would help if she wanted help, and stay out of the parts she wanted to handle herself. Cora smiled slightly at that. Not triumph, just acknowledgement. It was one of the strange rewards of surviving our worst years together. We could now feel an old pattern beginning, without having to follow it all the way to the same ending. The application process began that weekend. For the next several evenings, the kitchen table filled with drafts. Cora worked in bursts, sometimes 20 focused minutes, sometimes 2 hours spent changing 3 sentences. I learned to wait until she asked, before reading anything. That restraint was harder than it sounds. For years, helping had been one of the safest ways I knew to love her. Now, helping sometimes meant keeping my hands off the keyboard. The program being paid mattered too. 10 weeks in New York would still require transportation, clothes appropriate for an office, and the small costs that accumulate when an 18-year-old starts living part of her life outside home. But Cora would not have to ask me to finance the entire experience. She noticed that before I did. I could see the relief in the way she read the stipend information twice. Independence still mattered intensely to her. The difference was that she no longer treated accepting support as failure. I had expected Cora to treat it the way she treated most high-stakes projects. Create a schedule, work too late, refuse assistance until exhaustion forced it. Some of that still happened. Growth had not erased her habits. But the difference was visible. She asked Evelyn for permission to use data from the pantry project. She asked a teacher for feedback on how clearly she explained her role. She let Tessa read one paragraph and did not collapse, when Tessa circled a sentence and wrote that it sounded like a corporate brochure. Years earlier, criticism could make Cora behave as though she had failed an invisible test of worth. Now she rolled her eyes, rewrote the sentence, and moved on. I noticed. I did not praise it. Not everything needed to become a lesson simply because I understood its history. The strongest part of her application was the pantry project. It was also the least glamorous. The pantry received donations from grocery stores, local drives, churches, and private donors. Some weeks brought more canned vegetables than anyone could reasonably distribute. Other weeks, families arrived asking for staples that had run out 2 days earlier. Volunteers recorded inventory differently depending on who was working. A few products expired because nobody had noticed how long they had been sitting behind newer donations. Cora had started with a spreadsheet, nothing more. She tracked what entered, what left, which items moved quickly, and which ones sat. Over time, with Evelyn's approval, she simplified the system so volunteers could update it without needing to understand formulas or databases. The pantry reduced some waste and became better at anticipating which basics needed replenishing before shelves emptied. That was the story Cora wanted Hartwell to see. A small problem, a useful solution, people who benefited. She did not pretend she had transformed the food system of northern New Jersey. She did not inflate her role. She described where the first version had failed and what volunteers had taught her. That honesty made the work stronger. The application also included an essay about leadership. That was the section I worried about most, because one of the prompts asked candidates to describe an experience that had shaped how they thought about responsibility. Cora could have written about adoption. She could have written about abandonment. She could have written about discovering the truth at 13, running away, then rebuilding trust with me. It would have been emotionally powerful. It also would have been easy to turn pain into a performance. Cora chose something else. She wrote about the first month at the pantry when she kept correcting volunteer entries herself rather than fixing the system that caused the mistakes. Evelyn had finally told her, in her practical way, that a process was not useful if only one person knew how to keep it working. Cora connected that experience to leadership without turning it into philosophy. She wrote about designing systems that ordinary people could actually use, and about learning that usefulness mattered more than being the person everyone depended on. I read the draft once because she asked me to. The old wound was there if you knew where to look. She had simply stopped introducing herself through it. That moved me more than any essay about Celeste could have. By the second week of February, her application was submitted. The morning after she submitted it, Cora opened the portal before breakfast, as if a decision might already be waiting. By the third day, she stopped checking every hour. The application settled into the background, with everything else she had going on: classes, college forms, pantry shifts, and the ordinary uncertainty of senior year. I was glad for the competing demands. Hartwell remained important, without becoming the single object around which our household revolved. One evening she asked me to look over the calendar she had made for the rest of spring. The fellowship decision sat beside exam dates, a pantry deadline, graduation rehearsal, and 2 college deposit reminders. Seeing Hartwell reduced to one square among many did something useful to both of us. Whatever answer came, Cora already had a life moving forward around it. Then came the waiting. Hartwell did something I had not expected. Before the first review began, applicants were invited to an online information session about the selection process. Cora watched it from the living room while I sorted paperwork nearby. That was the first time I heard Naomi Brooks's name. Naomi was the fellowship director. On the screen, she came across as calm and efficient, rather than charismatic. She explained that the program had grown quickly over the previous few years, and now received far more qualified applications than it could accept. To reduce bias during the first stage, identifying information was separated from the materials reviewers scored. Academic record, project work, recommendations, and written responses were evaluated. without the reviewers initially seeing names, photographs, or family connections. Only candidates who advanced would have their identities restored for the finalist stage. After that, program staff and an executive sponsor panel would complete final review. Naomi spent less than a minute on the conflict of interest policy. Any reviewer who recognized a candidate through a personal, family, or professional relationship was expected to disclose the conflict and step away from decisions involving that applicant. At the time, the rule reassured me. It seemed almost designed for the fear sitting beside me. If Cora's application reached the first reviewers, Celeste could not know it was hers. And if Cora advanced far enough for names to be revealed, Hartwell already had a procedure for exactly that kind of problem. Disclosure, recusal. Someone else would make the decision. I did not know then how important those ordinary instructions would become. After the webinar ended, Cora closed the laptop and went upstairs to finish homework. She did not discuss Celeste. Neither did I. That night was one of the first times I allowed myself to imagine the program without my sister inside it. New York was less than an hour away, on a good day. Cora could take the fellowship, commute for part of it, or use the program housing if the schedule required it, learn something real, meet people outside her school, and come home with a clearer idea of what she wanted to study. Hartwell began looking like a place again, rather than a symbol. That mattered. March moved slowly. The anonymous stage was strangely freeing. Because no reviewer could yet connect the file to Celeste, there was nothing for me to monitor beyond the ordinary application portal. Cora checked it less often than I did, though I tried not to let her catch me. Eventually, even I stopped. We had spent too many years turning uncertainty into vigilance, and Hartwell did not deserve that much control over our kitchen. Cora kept improving the pantry documentation while she waited. She rewrote instructions so a volunteer could understand them without asking her to stand nearby, and Evelyn deliberately handed the system to newer helpers while Cora watched from across the room. That irritated her at first. Then it pleased her when the process worked without her. The change was small, but it reflected something larger. Cora was beginning to see that being needed all the time was not the same as being valuable. College decisions began arriving at the same time, which helped keep the fellowship from becoming the only thing we talked about. Cora received good news from some schools, disappointing news from others, and learned the ordinary humiliation of financial aid portals that seemed designed to make 17 forms look like one. Tessa came over one Saturday, while Cora was checking email, and announced that she had been rejected from a summer program she had barely wanted in the first place. 10 minutes later, she was eating cereal from one of my bowls and complaining about something else entirely. I watched Cora laugh at her. There had been a time when rejection, even somebody else's, would have tightened something in my daughter. Now, she seemed able to let outcomes remain outcomes instead of converting them into verdicts. The difference was subtle. It made me hopeful. Evelyn was even less impressed by prestige. When Cora told her she had applied to Hartwell, Evelyn was pleased but mostly concerned about whether Cora would still help document the pantry system before leaving for college. She treated the fellowship as one possibility among many. That may have been the healthiest reaction anyone gave her. Then, near the end of March, Cora came into the kitchen carrying her phone. She did not speak right away. The screen was open to an email. Hartwell had notified her that her anonymous application had advanced with one of the strongest scores in the review pool. For several seconds, I saw the 10-year-old girl who had hidden a bad grade because she feared failure could make her difficult to love. Then that image disappeared beneath the 18-year-old standing in front of me. She read the email again. Her smile arrived slowly. This result mattered differently because the people who had evaluated her did not know her name. They did not know Celeste. They did not know me. They did not know she was adopted. Nobody had chosen her because her history was moving. Nobody had rejected her because it was inconvenient. They had read her work, and they had moved it forward. I wanted to say something large enough to mark the moment, Instead, I hugged her. Cora allowed it for several seconds before pretending I was crushing her. The rest of that evening stayed wonderfully ordinary. We ordered takeout because neither of us felt like cooking. Cora texted Tessa. She sent Evelyn a screenshot of the email, and Evelyn responded with a reminder not to forget her Saturday shift. I did not mention Celeste once. That was my own small victory. For years, I had allowed my sister's absence to occupy too much space in moments that belonged to Cora. Even after I learned better, the habit lingered. A good grade could become proof Cora was thriving without Celeste. A hard day could become evidence of the wound Celeste had caused. That night, I let an accomplishment be only an accomplishment. Cora had done well. She was allowed to enjoy it, without anyone's abandonment standing in the room. The finalist notification came in April. Hartwell informed Cora that she had advanced again and would move into the final review stage. The email explained that candidate identities would now be restored because the next phase included program-specific matching, scheduling checks, and final executive review. That was when the old uneasiness returned. Not enough to change my mind. Enough that I noticed it. Cora noticed too. She read the message twice, then placed her phone face down. Neither of us said Celeste's name. We did not need to. The difference between this moment and February was that I no longer asked Cora to withdraw. She had entered anonymously. She had been judged on merit. Hartwell itself had rules for conflicts. Whatever happened next, I would not make her smaller to prevent another adult from being uncomfortable. A few days later, Cora received instructions for the remaining stage. Then there was nothing to do but wait again. What happened inside Hartwell that week was not something I witnessed. I need to be clear about that because there were details I only learned later, after records were reviewed and the sequence had been reconstructed for us. At the time, all I knew was that finalist identities had been released to the small executive sponsor panel. I did not know which reviewer opened which file first. I did not know whether Celeste was in her office, a conference room, or somewhere else when the names appeared. I did not know how long she stared at the screen. What I learned later was much simpler. That afternoon, the anonymous application Hartwell's reviewers had scored so highly stopped being only an application number. A name appeared beside it. Cora Whitaker. And for the first time in 18 years, my sister was forced to look at the future of the daughter she had once left behind. The call came the next morning. I was at work when my phone lit up beside a stack of student files. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was New York. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then something in me stopped. For 18 years, Celeste had existed in my life, mostly as an absence with a name attached to it. There had been no birthday calls, no cautious messages asking whether Cora was healthy, no awkward attempt to learn what kind of child she had become. I had trained myself not to expect contact because expectation had become another form of waiting. I answered anyway. I knew her voice before she identified herself. Age had changed it slightly. The sharpness was lower now, the pace more measured, but the control was the same. Celeste had always spoken as though sentences were tools meant to produce outcomes. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask whether Cora was happy. She did not ask what 18 years had looked like. Her first meaningful sentence was the only one that mattered. You need to make her withdraw. For a moment, the office around me became unreal. A printer clicked somewhere behind the partition. 2 students were talking quietly in the hallway. My computer screen still showed an appointment schedule for the afternoon. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. Celeste began explaining before I answered. Cora's application, she said, had reached a stage where senior sponsors could see names. The fellowship had become visible enough internally that any personal connection could create questions. Celeste was in the middle of a succession process. Hartwell had been evaluating candidates for a chief strategy officer role, and she was close enough to the decision that she did not want family history unexpectedly entering the process. She framed everything as risk management. Optics, conflicts, unnecessary complications. The language was polished, professional, and carefully drained of anything that sounded like a mother speaking about her daughter. I listened until the structure became familiar. 18 years earlier, Celeste had stood in my house and described a newborn as incompatible with the future she wanted. Now she was describing an 18-year-old application the same way. Different vocabulary. Sam equation. Cora existed. Cora complicated something, therefore Cora should disappear from the situation. I asked one question. Had she spoken to Cora? The pause was brief. No, of course she had not. Celeste said direct contact would only make things more difficult. She believed the cleanest solution was for me to persuade Cora to withdraw voluntarily before final decisions were made. Voluntarily. That word nearly undid me. I turned away from the open doorway of my office and lowered my voice. I told Celeste that Cora was 18 years old and had applied on her own merit. I was not going to remove her from an opportunity simply because her existence made someone else uncomfortable. Celeste's tone tightened. She insisted I was making the matter emotional. That accusation might have worked on me years earlier. Celeste had always used emotion as though it were evidence of bad judgment. The person who cared less automatically became the more rational person in the room. But there was nothing irrational about what I was seeing. Hartwell itself had a conflict procedure. I had heard Naomi Brooks explain it during the webinar. If a reviewer recognized a candidate through a family or personal relationship, that reviewer was supposed to disclose the conflict and step away. The path was already there. Celeste did not need Cora to withdraw. Celeste needed to recuse herself. When I said that, the silence on the line changed. Not shock, resistance. She argued that disclosure would create questions she had spent years avoiding. Senior leadership would want to know why her biological daughter had a different surname, why there had never been any mention of her, why Celeste had no relationship with the applicant. Even if there were no formal consequences, she believed the situation would affect how colleagues viewed her judgment and personal history. There it was. Not Cora's problem. Celeste's story. For 18 years, Celeste had been able to live inside a version of the past where she had made a difficult but sensible decision. Cora had been raised by family. Mara had wanted a child. Everyone had supposedly received what they needed. Disclosure would require other people to see the missing piece. A daughter existed, and Celeste had never gone back. She never said any of that plainly. I did not need her private thoughts to understand the shape of what she was protecting. I had the evidence in what she was asking me to do. Remove Cora, so Celeste would not have to explain Cora. I looked through the glass wall of my office at students crossing the corridor outside. Some carried backpacks. One was laughing into a phone. Their lives were full of choices adults could advise, but no longer make for them. Cora was one of them now. I had spent years learning that. I told Celeste the decision belonged to her. She could disclose the relationship. She could recuse. She could explain whatever she chose to explain. But I would not make Cora withdraw. Celeste said the situation could become ugly. I remember almost laughing at the word. Ugly had been a 4-day-old infant placed at my feet and described as a gift. Ugly had been a 13-year-old girl, discovering the date on a care authorization and realizing her mother had hidden the truth. An 18-year-old being fairly evaluated for a fellowship was not ugly. It was simply inconvenient to Celeste. I did not say all of that. I only told her again that I would not make Cora disappear. Then I ended the call. I still had appointments scheduled that afternoon. For the next hour, I moved through them with the strange discipline people use when private life has broken open in the middle of a workday. I helped one student correct a financial aid form and another reschedule a placement test. My voice sounded normal. My hands did what they were supposed to do. Between students, I kept seeing Celeste's request in its simplest form. Not call Cora, not explain herself, just remove the problem before anyone else could see it. By 3 o'clock, I knew I could not spend the rest of the day pretending concentration would return. I told my supervisor I needed to leave early, gathered my things, and sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. 18 years earlier, I had gone from Celeste's decision straight into caring for a newborn. There had been no time to consider what honesty would later cost. Now I had hours to understand exactly what telling Cora would do, and exactly what repeating my old silence would do instead. For several minutes, I stayed in my office with the phone still in my hand. My first instinct was to protect Cora from the conversation. The thought arrived so quickly, I almost missed the irony. I could wait. I could see what Hartwell did. I could avoid telling her that Celeste had called until there was something concrete to worry about. That was exactly how the old mistake had begun. Not with malice, with delay. With the belief that I could decide when pain became necessary. I opened a message to Cora, then deleted it. This was not something to send between her last class and an afternoon bus ride. I finished work early and went home. Cora knew something had happened as soon as she walked into the kitchen. I must have looked different because she dropped her bag without taking off her coat and waited. Years earlier, I would have spent 10 minutes preparing the ground. That evening, I gave her the truth in the order it happened. Celeste had called. She knew Cora was a finalist. She wanted Cora to withdraw. She had not asked how Cora was. I did not soften the order, and I did not rush past the part that hurt most. Cora had spent years learning to tolerate difficult facts from me, as long as I gave them to her honestly. I could see that trust working even while the information wounded her. She did not have to search my face for the missing piece this time. There was no second version waiting in a box. No date she would discover years later. Everything I knew was already on the table. I watched the information reach my daughter one piece at a time. The last detail hurt most. Not the withdrawal request, not Hartwell, the absence of a question. Cora turned toward the kitchen window and stood there with her arms folded. Outside, a neighbor was pulling trash bins toward the curb. The ordinary motion seemed almost cruel in its normalcy. After a while, she asked whether Celeste knew how old she was. I said yes. She asked whether Celeste knew where she had grown up. I told her I assumed Hartwell's application gave enough identifying information by the finalist stage to make it obvious who she was, but I did not pretend to know exactly what Celeste had seen. Cora nodded. That was all. She did not cry. She did not ask me to comfort her. Her restraint worried me because I recognized the old pattern. Take the pain. Make yourself smaller around it. Keep functioning. I told her what Naomi had said during the webinar about conflicts. Cora remembered. I explained that Celeste had the option to disclose and recuse. I made sure not to turn that into a promise that Hartwell would handle everything perfectly. I did not know what would happen inside the company. What I knew was simpler. Cora did not have to solve Celeste's conflict for her. Cora sat at the table then. For several minutes, she looked at the closed laptop in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She said she did not want special treatment. She did not want anyone advancing her application because of who Celeste was. She did not want anyone rejecting it for the same reason. She wanted the application judged the way it had been judged when her name was hidden. That was the entire principle. Fairness, not revenge. I asked whether she wanted to withdraw anyway. The question was hers now, not mine. Cora shook her head. She had worked too hard to spend the rest of her life avoiding any place Celeste might occupy. If Hartwell rejected her fairly, she could live with that. What she would not do was remove herself to keep Celeste comfortable. I felt the old urge to tell her I was proud. I kept it to myself. This was not a performance for me. It was her decision. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. That waiting was worse, because the call had changed everything. Every email notification made both of us look up. Cora went to school, worked a pantry shift, finished an assignment, and behaved so normally that I found myself watching her more than I should have. I recognized the habit and stopped. She did not need to be monitored simply because she had been hurt. On the second evening, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. The light from the screen washed her face pale. For 1 second, I thought the final acceptance had come. Then I saw the subject line, Hartwell Emerging Leaders Fellowship Application Decision. Cora had already opened it. Her hands rested flat on either side of the computer. The email was short. She had not been selected. Hartwell thanked her for the strength of her application and wished her well in future opportunities. There was no explanation beyond the usual language about a competitive pool and limited places. Nothing about the email looked improper. That was what made it difficult. Competitive fellowships reject strong applicants all the time. A high anonymous score was not a guarantee. Final stage review could consider other factors. There were perfectly legitimate reasons Cora might not have been chosen. I reminded myself of all of them. Before saying anything, Cora closed the laptop halfway. For a moment, she looked less like the 18-year-old who had argued for the right to make her own choices, and more like the child who had once hidden a bad science grade inside a notebook. I knew better than to fill the silence. Eventually, she said, "She saw me again, and she still didn't choose me." There was no useful contradiction to offer. I could tell Cora that Celeste might not have made the final decision. I could tell her Hartwell had multiple reviewers. I could tell her rejection did not prove interference. All of those things were logically true. None addressed what Cora was feeling. Celeste had seen her name. Celeste's first response had been to ask that she disappear. Whether the rejection itself was connected to that or not, the second wound had already happened. I sat beside her. I did not tell her someone refusing to choose her said more about them than about her. I believed that, but she had heard enough philosophy from adults across her life. This moment needed less language, not more. So, I stayed. We sat beside each other until the kitchen lights became the brightest thing in the dark windows. Cora did not reopen the email. Eventually she stood, put her glass in the sink, and went upstairs with the laptop tucked under one arm. I heard her bedroom door close, but not lock. The next morning she came down dressed for school and ate half a piece of toast. I almost asked whether she wanted to stay home. I stopped because I knew what the offer would sound like to her. Another way the rejection could take something else. She left at the usual time. I watched through the window until she reached the corner, then forced myself away from the glass. By afternoon, she had texted only to ask whether we needed milk. That message relieved me more than any declaration that she was fine would have. She was hurt, but she was still participating in the small responsibilities of home. I answered with one word and left it there. We had learned enough by then not to turn every wound into an emergency meeting. The next morning, Cora put the fellowship materials into a drawer. The printed program description went in first. Then her notes. Then the copy of her pantry project summary. She closed the drawer and went to school. For several days, she would not discuss Hartwell. She still volunteered at the pantry. She still answered college emails. She still met Tessa for coffee on Saturday. But something had gone quieter in her. Not broken, retracted, like a hand pulled back from something hot. I worried about what the rejection was teaching her. Not that she could fail. She had learned years ago that failure was survivable. This was more dangerous. The old lesson had returned wearing adult clothes. Maybe when my existence becomes inconvenient, I should leave first. I refused to reinforce it by turning Hartwell into the center of our household. We kept moving. Dinner happened. Work happened. Laundry accumulated. College forms still needed signatures. Then, 4 days after the rejection, Cora received another email. She called me from upstairs. Not loudly, just my name. I found her standing beside her desk with the laptop open. The message came from Hartwell's Fellowship Administration. It did not reverse the rejection. It did not offer her a place. It said the program had identified an internal inconsistency connected to her application and was conducting an administrative review. Her file would remain open while the issue was examined. She did not need to submit anything new unless contacted. Cora read it twice, so did I. We had no idea what internal inconsistency meant. A score entered incorrectly, a missing document, a reviewer error, a system issue. Anything was possible. I deliberately did not say Celeste's name. The email itself gave us no reason to assume wrongdoing. 2 days later, another message arrived. This one came directly from Naomi Brooks. She requested a short call with Cora and said a parent or trusted adult could join if Cora wished. Cora asked me to sit with her. We took the call at the same kitchen table where she had first shown me the Hartwell program months earlier. Naomi did not begin by accusing anyone. She explained that Hartwell was reviewing a discrepancy between different stages of Cora's application and needed to verify one factual point before moving further. Her tone remained careful, procedural. Then she asked the question that changed the shape of everything. Did Cora Whitaker have any personal or family relationship with Hartwell executive Celeste Vale? Cora's eyes moved toward me, and for the first time since the rejection email arrived, I understood that Hartwell was not simply reconsidering whether my daughter had been good enough. They were trying to understand what had happened after someone learned who she was. Naomi's question hung over the kitchen table for only a second before Cora answered it. Yes. Celeste Vale was her biological mother. She said it plainly, without adding history or trying to control what Naomi might think of it. Then she looked at me, and I filled in only what Hartwell actually needed to know. Celeste was my older sister. I had adopted Cora as a baby. There had been no relationship between Celeste and Cora during the 18 years that followed. I also told Naomi about the phone call. I did not dramatize it. I repeated the substance as accurately as I could. Celeste had contacted me after finalist identities were released and told me I needed to make Cora withdraw. She had raised concerns about conflict, optics, and her own succession review. When I pointed out that Hartwell had a recusal process, she had still wanted Cora removed instead. Naomi did not react the way people do in movies when one sentence suddenly exposes everything. She took notes. She asked which day the call occurred. She asked whether Celeste had contacted Cora directly. She confirmed that Cora had refused to withdraw, and that the rejection had arrived afterward. The questions were calm enough to make the situation feel more serious, not less. Nothing had been proven simply because our history was painful. That distinction mattered. Naomi explained that the administrative review had begun before anyone at Hartwell knew Celeste was Cora's biological mother. The system had flagged a mismatch between the way Cora's application had performed during the anonymous stages and what happened after identities were restored. Program staff were required to examine unusual changes before the final fellowship cohort was locked. She did not bury us in policy. She gave us 3 facts. The first was the easiest. Cora's application had scored near the top of the anonymous review pool. We already knew she had done well, but we had not known how well. The second fact mattered more. Before names were revealed, Celeste had participated in the executive sponsor review of the ranked finalist pool. At that stage, she had accepted the scoring and had raised no concern about the application later identified as Cora's. The application had not changed afterward. The project was the same. The grades were the same. The recommendation was the same. The written responses were the same. Only the name changed. The third fact was the reason Naomi was calling us. After finalist identities were restored, Celeste had entered a concern against Cora's application and caused it to be removed from the active finalist group. She had not disclosed that Cora was her biological daughter. She had not recused herself. The stated concern did not match anything the anonymous reviewers had identified. Naomi stopped there. No dramatic accusation. No declaration that Celeste was guilty of some crime. Just the sequence. Before the name approved. After the name removed. No conflict disclosed. I looked at Cora. She was staring at the edge of the laptop, one thumb rubbing slowly over a scratch in the table. For 18 years, the ugliest parts of our family history had always contained some space where Celeste could hide inside her own explanation. She had been overwhelmed. She had been ambitious. She had believed I could provide stability. She had convinced herself that leaving a baby with family was different from abandonment. But this was not 2008. Cora was not 4 days old. No one had asked Celeste to become a mother. No one had asked her to give up a job. Hartwell had provided a procedure designed precisely for what had happened. Disclose the relationship. Step away. Let someone else judge the application. Celeste had been offered an exit that required no sacrifice except honesty. She had chosen something else. Naomi made it clear that Hartwell's internal review would continue whether Cora wanted to pursue the fellowship or not. The issue now involved the integrity of their own selection process. Cora could decide how much she wanted to participate. If she preferred, she could provide only the factual information already given and step back. That was when Cora finally spoke. She wanted to know what would happen to Celeste. Naomi could not answer. The fellowship office was not responsible for deciding employment consequences, and the review was still ongoing. Senior leadership and the appropriate internal people would determine what, if anything, followed. The uncertainty seemed to trouble Cora more than a definite answer might have. When the call ended, she closed the laptop. The kitchen stayed silent. I expected anger. Instead, Cora looked tired. The tiredness stayed with her through dinner. She ate half of what was on her plate, then opened a college portal because a housing deadline was approaching. Watching her move from a question about her biological mother's conduct to a form asking whether she preferred a quiet dorm floor felt almost absurd. But that was the shape of her life now. Celeste could interrupt it. She no longer got to become all of it. Later, I passed Cora's room and saw her sitting cross-legged on the floor with the old document box open beside her. She was not rereading the temporary authorization. She was holding the hospital bracelet, turning it once around her fingers before putting it back. When she closed the lid, she did not carry the box to me. She returned it to the shelf herself. She stood, carried her glass to the sink, rinsed it, wiped a drop of water from the counter, and returned the sponge exactly where it belonged. The old version of her had resurfaced in those tiny movements. Control the manageable things. Do not become difficult. She said she wanted to drop the whole thing, not the fellowship application alone. The review. She did not want Hartwell calling her again. She did not want statements, questions, meetings, or her family history written into somebody's internal file. Most of all, she did not want to be responsible for destroying Celeste's career. The word responsible caught me. I had heard versions of it before. At 8, Cora wondered whether she had been a bad baby. At 10, she promised she would not be difficult after a bad grade. At 13, she tried to disappear into other people's rules because she was tired of adults making decisions around her. Now, at 18, she had learned that someone with far more power had chosen to disadvantage her, and her first instinct was to protect that person from the consequences. The wound had grown up with her. I wanted to tell her exactly what to do. That urge came fast and strong. Cooperate. Tell Hartwell everything. Do not let Celeste get away with this. For years, I might have called that protection. I knew better now, so I did not tell her. I asked what she wanted if Celeste's career were removed from the equation. Cora did not answer immediately. She paced once to the window and back. Outside, the first leaves had begun appearing on the trees, thin green against the branches. Eventually, she said she wanted the application judged fairly. That was all she had wanted from the beginning. She did not want a place because Hartwell felt sorry for her. She did not want someone removed because she demanded punishment. She wanted the same application that had been good enough when anonymous to receive the same consideration after someone learned her name. I asked whether telling Naomi the truth changed that goal. Cora shook her head. What frightened her was everything that might happen after. I understood. Truth often feels clean only before consequences begin. Once other people lose something, even something their own actions put at risk, the person who spoke can start feeling as though silence would have been kinder. Cora had spent most of her life trying not to be the reason anyone's life became harder. That was why I chose my next words carefully. Telling the truth about what someone did is not the same as doing it to them. Cora looked at me. I did not add anything. No speech about justice. No lecture about accountability. The sentence did not need help. The next morning, Cora emailed Naomi. She drafted the message twice. The first version was defensive and too long. The second tried so hard to sound unaffected that it barely sounded like her. On the third attempt, she kept only what mattered. She would answer factual questions. She did not want preferential treatment, and she wanted her application handled under the same standards that applied before anyone knew her identity. She read it once, pressed send, and went downstairs to make breakfast. That small sequence mattered to me, because Cora had spent much of childhood believing control came from preventing mistakes. Now she was learning another kind of control, the ability to choose a clear action even when she could not control the outcome. She agreed to cooperate with the review. She also stated that she was not asking Hartwell to punish Celeste, restore her application automatically, or give her any preference. She would answer factual questions and allow the process to proceed. That choice changed something in her. Not dramatically. She still checked her email too often. She still became quiet when Hartwell's name appeared on her phone. But she stopped speaking as though whatever happened to Celeste would belong to her. For several days, nothing new reached us. Hartwell kept working from the record already in its system, and Naomi contacted Cora only when she needed a factual confirmation. By then the question had narrowed to something the existing sequence could answer without spectacle. Why had an application Celeste accepted anonymously become unacceptable only after the applicant's name appeared? Hartwell took preliminary action while that question was examined. Celeste was removed from any further fellowship decisions. Her own promotion process was paused. The wording mattered. Paused was not withdrawn. And removal from the fellowship review was not a final judgment about her employment. Cora read the update carefully and then set her phone down. She had become suspicious of outcomes that arrived too cleanly, and I was glad Hartwell was not pretending the investigation was finished before it was. For us, the practical effect was simple. Celeste no longer had access to decisions about Cora's application, while the company examined what had happened. That protected the process without requiring Cora to become prosecutor, investigator, or public accuser. She could remain what she had been from the beginning, an applicant asking to be judged on her own work. Naomi did not present either measure as punishment. They were safeguards while the review continued. That difference mattered to me, because I had seen too many people confuse accusation with conclusion. Hartwell had not finished. Neither had Cora. For roughly 2 weeks, our lives divided themselves between ordinary things and the knowledge that something larger was moving somewhere outside our house. Cora still had final exams approaching. She still worked Saturdays at the pantry. Tessa still sent her ridiculous videos at midnight. I still went to work and met students who believed their own deadlines were the most important emergencies in existence. That normalcy kept us from turning the review into the center of our lives. I made a point of not asking whether Hartwell had contacted her every time she came home. Some days there was an update, and she told me. Most days there was nothing. We let nothing be nothing. Cora studied at the dining table while I paid bills nearby. On Fridays, she worked on the pantry guide she promised Evelyn she would finish before summer. The review existed at the edge of the room, rather than occupying every chair. That balance was new for both of us. When Cora was younger, I had responded to uncertainty by checking, questioning, and trying to get ahead of whatever might hurt her. Now, the most useful thing I could offer was steadiness without surveillance. If she wanted to talk, I stayed. If she did not, dinner still needed cooking. The review also changed the way Cora spoke about Celeste. She stopped asking what outcome would be fair to her biological mother and began separating that question from the one Hartwell had to answer. She could feel conflicted about Celeste as a person, while still allowing the company to examine Celeste as an executive. Holding those two ideas at once was harder than anger, but it was healthier than making herself responsible for both. One Saturday at the pantry, I arrived early enough to see Cora working beside Evelyn. They were checking a delivery against the inventory system Cora had helped build. One box had been entered twice. Months earlier, Cora would have corrected it silently herself. This time, she showed another volunteer where the duplication had happened, then stepped aside and let him fix it. Such a small thing. I stood near the entrance watching her and thought about how much of growth is invisible unless you remember the earlier version. Cora no longer needed to be the person who carried everything. Not boxes, not systems, not Celeste's consequences. Evelyn noticed me and waved. Cora did too. There was no conversation about Hartwell. I was grateful for that. The next meaningful update came in mid-May. By then, Hartwell had completed enough of the internal review to confirm the conflict had not been disclosed and that Celeste's intervention had occurred after identity reveal. Naomi told us the fellowship office would now step back from the employment side of the matter. That portion belonged elsewhere inside the company. Cora's own application would remain preserved until they knew how the review affected final selection. The cohort had not yet been locked. That detail gave Cora something practical to hold on to. Her opportunity was not restored, but it was not dead either. Cora handled that uncertainty better than she would have a few years earlier. She did not reopen the portal every night. She kept copies of every message in one folder, then stopped touching them unless Naomi contacted her. The rest of her attention went where it still belonged. Graduation requirements, college paperwork, the pantry, and the friendships that had nothing to do with Celeste. I watched that balance with a kind of quiet pride. I tried not to turn into pressure. Cora was not proving she was unaffected. She was proving pain could exist beside the rest of her life without swallowing it. Later that evening, another message arrived. Not from Naomi. From Celeste. She did not contact Cora directly. The request came through a neutral channel after Hartwell had already established the key facts. Celeste wanted to meet privately before the company completed its review. The wording made clear that Hartwell had not ordered the meeting. It was personal, voluntary, separate from the official process. I read the message twice before giving the phone back to Cora. My first reaction surprised me. I wanted her to refuse. Not because I feared Celeste could manipulate the review through one conversation. That boundary had already been established. I wanted Cora to refuse because I remembered the 13-year-old sitting on my bedroom floor with the hospital bracelet in her hand. I remembered the 18-year-old closing a rejection email and saying Celeste had seen her again and still had not chosen her. There are some doors a mother wants to seal forever once she knows what waits behind them. But this was not my door. Cora read the request several times. She did not answer that night. The next day, she went to school. She came home, ate dinner, finished homework, and asked me where we had put one of the college financial aid documents. Only after everything else was done did she return to Celeste's request. She told me she wanted to go. I asked whether she wanted me nearby. She said she wanted me in the room. That answer surprised me more than the decision to meet Celeste. Years earlier, Cora might have seen bringing me as evidence that she was not strong enough to face her biological mother alone. Now she did not confuse independence with isolation. She was not asking me to speak for her. She was not asking me to protect her from every painful sentence. She was choosing who stood beside her while she spoke for herself. I told her I would come. Cora looked down at the meeting request one last time. Then she said, "Not because I'm afraid of her, because I want her to see who stayed." And in that moment, I understood that the meeting ahead was no longer about whether Celeste would finally choose her daughter. It was about whether Cora still needed her to. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in mid-May, in a private meeting room at a midtown business center, several blocks from Hartwell. Celeste had arranged it herself after Cora agreed to meet. By then, the company had already established the facts it needed to examine. Celeste's participation in fellowship decisions had been suspended, her promotion process had been paused, and the internal review was moving on its own track. Nothing said in that room would replace the company's process. What remained between us was personal. For 3 days, I watched Cora prepare without turning preparation into performance. She went to school, worked one pantry shift, and completed a final presentation for class. The meeting did not become a rehearsal that swallowed everything around it. That mattered, because at 13, she had once allowed one painful truth to reorganize every room in our house. At 18, she could carry something heavy without letting it become the only thing she carried. I struggled more than she did. I caught myself inventing questions Celeste might ask, and answers Cora might need. Twice I opened my mouth to offer advice and stopped. Cora had not invited me, so I could manage the conversation. She had invited me to witness it. She did not write a speech. She did not make a list of accusations. She did not ask me what she should say. The night before, I found her sitting at the dining table with the hospital bracelet beside her laptop. She had taken it from the records box and placed it near her hand, not dramatically, almost as if she needed to remind herself that the conversation ahead had begun long before Hartwell ever existed in her life. I did not ask why she had brought it out. She eventually returned it to the box. That told me enough. On the drive into Manhattan the next day, traffic gave me too much time to remember. I remembered a January night in 2008. Celeste moving carefully through my doorway, one hand on a suitcase, the other on a newborn carrier. I remembered the temporary care authorization on my table. I remembered the sound of Cora crying after the car disappeared down the road. Now the same child sat beside me wearing a navy jacket over a white blouse, one foot tapping lightly against the floorboard whenever traffic stopped. 18 years earlier, I had held all the responsibility and none of the authority. Now Cora was old enough to speak for herself. That should have made the drive easier. It did not. The instinct to protect a child does not disappear when the child becomes an adult. It only becomes more complicated because protection can no longer mean stepping in front of every impact. Sometimes it means sitting beside her while she chooses to walk into one. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. Cora looked out the window. Neither of us mentioned Celeste until we were already in the building. The business center occupied 2 quiet floors above a midtown avenue. Downstairs, traffic rolled past in uneven waves. Upstairs, the room held only a rectangular table, 4 chairs, a pitcher of water, and a window looking toward another wall of glass. There were no Hartwell logos and no company staff waiting outside. That helped. Whatever happened there belonged to our family, not to a corporate proceeding. The chairs had been arranged with 3 on one side and 1 on the other. I moved 1 chair before Celeste arrived, so Cora and I would sit beside each other, rather than opposite each other like 2 sides in a hearing. The room smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and coffee from the shared hallway machine. Somewhere beyond the door, a copier ran for a few seconds and stopped. The ordinariness helped. No setting could make the conversation ahead ceremonial enough to erase what it was. 3 women sitting down with 18 years between them. The arrangement bothered me. I moved 1 chair so Cora and I sat beside each other instead. When Celeste entered, the first thing I noticed was that age had not made her less controlled. At 55, she carried herself with the same deliberate economy she had at 37. Her hair was shorter now, threaded with a little gray near the temples. Her suit fit perfectly. Nothing about her looked like someone whose career had been placed under review. Then she saw Cora. She stopped, only for a second, but I saw it. Cora had Celeste's eyes. I had noticed that when she was a baby, Though I had tried not to assign too much meaning to resemblance, genetics could produce a face. They could not raise one. Still, watching Celeste see the likeness for the first time was strange. Her gaze moved over Cora's features, as if matching them against something she had kept outside her life for almost 2 decades. Cora did not look away. No one spoke immediately. I was grateful. Silence made the moment more honest than any greeting could have. Celeste sat across from us. She did not ask whether Cora had traveled safely. She did not comment on how much she had grown. She did not say she was sorry. She began with Hartwell. The review, she explained, had become broader than she expected. Senior leadership was reconsidering her succession candidacy. Questions had reached people far above the fellowship program. Years of work, she said, were now being judged through one decision made during a complicated situation. I listened to the phrasing. One decision. Complicated situation. Even now, Celeste preferred language that blurred the edges. She spoke for several minutes about professional context, her role as executive sponsor, the sensitivity of finalist selection, the risk of perceived favoritism if anyone discovered a biological relationship between an executive reviewer and a candidate. Everything she said contained some truth. That was what made Celeste persuasive. Yes, the conflict was real. Yes, disclosure might have raised questions. Yes, a senior executive reviewing her own biological daughter would have created an ethical problem. But Hartwell had already given her the solution. Recuse. That was the part she kept stepping around. Cora let her finish. I could see her hands resting loosely in her lap, fingers still. Years earlier, during difficult conversations, she used to grip one thumb with the opposite hand until the skin turned pale. She was not doing that now. When Celeste finally stopped, Cora asked one question. When you saw my name, did you think about calling me before you thought about removing me? Celeste's face changed. Not much. A small tightening around the mouth. Her answer came indirectly. She said the timing had been impossible. Any contact could have created more complications. She had needed to protect the integrity of the process before addressing anything personal. Cora listened. Then she looked briefly at the table. The answer had done what I feared it would. Not because it was cruel, because it confirmed the order of Celeste's priorities. Process first, career second, story control third, daughter somewhere after that. Celeste tried to move toward the past without admitting she was doing it. She said what happened in 2008 could not be judged fairly from the distance of 18 years. She had been under enormous pressure. She had just given birth. She had been facing a career opportunity that would not wait. She had believed I was in a better position to provide the kind of stability a child needed. I did not interrupt. Some of those facts were true. What mattered was what she did with them. Celeste described herself as young, though 37 was not young enough to excuse not understanding what it meant to leave a 4-day-old infant. She described the situation as overwhelming. She described me as willing. She described Cora as having been loved. Each sentence placed one more cushion around the central fact. She had left. Cora listened without flinching. Then, Celeste said something that made me understand how little her explanation had changed in 18 years. She said that whatever pain the beginning had caused, the result proved she had made the correct decision. Cora had grown up in a stable home. She had done well in school. She had become exactly the kind of capable young woman Celeste claimed she had always hoped she would become. In Celeste's mind, Cora's good life had become evidence that abandonment had been wisdom. I felt anger move through me. But I kept still. This was not my confrontation. Cora asked whether Celeste had ever considered that the good life came from what happened after she left, not from the leaving itself. Celeste looked at me then. Only for a moment. That glance told me more than her answer. For years, she had folded my labor into her defense. I raised the child, therefore Celeste's choice worked. I stayed Therefore, Celeste had not truly abandoned anyone. I loved Cora. Therefore, the cost of Celeste's decision could be counted as zero. It was almost elegant. If you ignored the person who had been left. Celeste shifted in her chair. She said she knew the situation had been painful, but there had been no perfect option. She had given Cora access to a home with someone who desperately wanted a child. She had not left her in danger. She had not placed her with strangers. She had chosen family. Again, truth wrapped around avoidance. Cora's expression remained steady. I could not tell what she was feeling from her face, and I refused to invent it for her. Then Celeste said the sentence she had probably believed for 18 years. I gave you a better life. The room became very quiet. Outside the glass wall, someone walked past carrying a stack of folders. A phone rang somewhere down the hallway and stopped. Cora looked at Celeste. When she answered, her voice was calm. No, you gave me away. She gave me a life. Nothing followed. Not immediately. That silence mattered. I did not reach for Cora. I did not look at Celeste. I let the sentence remain where Cora had put it. Celeste's hand had been resting beside the water glass. After Cora spoke, her fingers moved toward it and stopped before touching it. For the first time since she entered the room, she seemed to have no next sentence prepared. Cora did not rescue her from that silence. She sat back and waited, no longer doing the emotional work of making another person comfortable. I kept my own hands folded in my lap. Every instinct I once had would have pushed me to add something to defend Cora, to correct Celeste, to explain why 18 years of staying mattered. None of it was necessary. Cora had said what belonged to her. My job in that moment was the same job I had finally learned elsewhere. Stay without taking over. That restraint felt almost physical. I could feel the words I was choosing not to say gather behind my teeth and then dissolve. Years earlier, silence had been my mistake because I used it to hide truth. Now silence served a different purpose. The truth had already been spoken, and adding myself to it would only make Cora's moment smaller. For 18 years, the word gift had belonged to Celeste. She had used it to transform responsibility into generosity. Now Cora had finally separated the two things Celeste had spent years trying to merge. Leaving was Celeste's act. Living was everything that came afterward. Eventually, Celeste looked down. It was the first time that afternoon she appeared unsure of what language to use. I had spent years imagining this kind of moment, and, in some versions, I had believed I would feel victorious. I did not. There was no triumph in watching my sister finally run out of explanations. Only sadness. For what Cora had carried, for what Celeste had refused to face, for the fact that a family could be connected by blood and still spend 18 years standing on opposite sides of one decision. Celeste tried once more to explain that she had believed I wanted motherhood enough to make the arrangement workable. I stopped myself from answering. It would have been easy to tell her that wanting a child had never meant wanting hers to be discarded. Easy to tell her that infertility had not turned me into an empty container waiting for someone else's baby. But those truths had already shaped every year of Cora's life. They did not need a speech now. Cora asked only one more important question. Why had Celeste interfered with the application instead of recusing herself? This time, Celeste did not hide completely behind procedure. She admitted that disclosure would have forced questions she did not want asked during the most important promotion process of her career. She had believed removing one application quietly would prevent a private history from becoming a professional issue. There it was. The fatal choice in its simplest form. She had been afraid Cora's existence might threaten her career. So she took the one action guaranteed to turn Cora's existence into a career issue. No one else had trapped her. No secret enemy. No revenge plan. No conspiracy. She had been given a clean path and refused it because the clean path required truth. Cora absorbed the answer without reacting visibly. When she spoke again, it was not about Hartwell. She told Celeste she did not know whether she ever wanted a relationship with her. She was not deciding that day. She would not exchange access to herself for an apology, and she would not promise forgiveness because Celeste had finally agreed to sit across a table from her. That decision belonged to Cora. So would every future one. Celeste asked whether there was anything she could do now. Cora did not give her a task. No list. No ritual of redemption. She said the company review should proceed on the facts. Whatever happened between them personally would be separate. I felt something loosen inside me when she said that. Cora had stopped treating every adult consequence as something she needed to manage. She was not demanding punishment. She was also not volunteering to save Celeste from it. Those were not the same thing. The meeting ended without an embrace. I was grateful for that too. There are stories where biology rushes back into place the moment people finally speak honestly. Real life is rarely so neat. Celeste remained seated when Cora stood. For one brief second, I saw something in my sister's face that may have been grief. I cannot know. I only know she looked at Cora differently than she had when the meeting began. Perhaps that was the first time she saw an adult daughter, instead of a complication she had once solved. Perhaps not. I was done guessing for her. Cora and I left together. Outside, Manhattan had moved on without us. Horns sounded along the avenue. Pedestrians crowded the corners. A delivery bicycle cut between stopped cars. The sky had turned bright after a morning of clouds. Cora walked beside me for half a block before slowing. I waited. She did not cry. She did not say she felt relieved. She only took a long breath and looked back once toward the doorway we had just left. Then she kept walking. On the drive home, we barely spoke. The meeting did not need immediate interpretation. Some experiences become smaller when people rush to explain them. That evening, Cora went to her room. I made dinner. She came downstairs later and ate. The next morning she went to school. The review at Hartwell continued. That was important. Nothing about the corporate process changed, because Cora had confronted Celeste. The company had already been examining the records for weeks. The personal meeting had not created evidence and had not replaced procedure. 5 days passed. On the 5th afternoon, Naomi contacted us. This time, the message contained an outcome. Hartwell had completed the relevant internal review. Celeste had been removed from the Chief Strategy Officer's succession process. The company had also decided she would no longer hold authority over the fellowship selection process, while broader leadership decisions concerning her role were handled internally. Naomi did not give us private employment details we were not entitled to know. She did not turn the call into a punishment announcement. She told us only what directly affected Cora. The interference had been confirmed. The fellowship office would now restore Cora's application to independent review. No one involved in Celeste's original decision would participate. And, most importantly, the panel would evaluate only the record that existed before finalist identities were revealed. The same grades, the same recommendation, the same pantry project, the same essays, the same young woman. Cora listened without smiling. I understood why. Being restored to a fair process was not the same as being accepted. There were still other strong applicants. There were still limited places. This time, however, whatever answer came next would belong to Cora's work, not to Celeste's fear. When the call ended, Cora closed her laptop and looked at me. For the first time since Hartwell had entered our kitchen months earlier, neither of us had anything left to fight about. Now we had to wait for the one decision Celeste had tried to prevent. What would happen when my daughter's future was finally judged without her mother standing in the way? The final answer from Hartwell came in June, but by then I had learned not to confuse an outcome with an ending. For nearly 2 weeks after the independent review began, Cora's application disappeared back into the same quiet machinery that had evaluated it before anyone knew her name. There were no more calls from Celeste. No urgent messages from Hartwell. Naomi had already explained that the new panel would use only the material that existed before finalist identities were revealed. And then she stepped back exactly as she should have. The waiting was almost ordinary. Cora studied for final exams. She finished the last changes to the pantry inventory guide, so Evelyn would not need to call her from New York every time a formula broke. College forms still appeared in our mailbox. Tessa came by twice. Once to return a sweatshirt she had apparently owned for 6 months without either of them remembering whose it was. Life refused to hold its breath, just because Hartwell had not yet answered. That helped. The company completed its employment review before the fellowship decision reached us. We were told only what we had a legitimate reason to know. Celeste had failed to disclose a direct family conflict, had used her reviewer authority to disadvantage an applicant after learning her identity, and had not recused herself despite a clear procedure requiring it. Her candidacy for Chief Strategy Officer was withdrawn. Hartwell also removed her from the fellowship sponsor structure and reduced the leadership authority attached to the role that had allowed her to interfere in the first place. Beyond that, the company kept its internal personnel decisions private. I appreciated the restraint. There was no dramatic firing in front of a boardroom, no security guards carrying boxes, no public announcement explaining 18 years of family history, no reporter waiting outside our house. Celeste did not lose her career because she had once chosen ambition over motherhood. Hartwell was not judging what happened in my living room in 2008. She faced professional consequences because, in 2026, she had been given authority and used it improperly when honesty became inconvenient. That distinction mattered. It was also what made the consequence feel unavoidable rather than theatrical. Celeste had always believed control protected her. She controlled how people saw her past. She controlled which parts of herself entered a room. She controlled the version of the story in which leaving Cora had been rational, even generous. Then a single name appeared on a fellowship file, and instead of stepping away, she tried to control that too. Her career did not collapse because Cora exposed her. It narrowed because Celeste had left a record of what she chose to do. The social consequence was quieter. I heard very little directly, which was appropriate. The pieces that reached us came through ordinary channels. Naomi mentioned that several senior people who had previously supported Celeste's advancement had withdrawn that support after reviewing the process. There were no public condemnations, no office revolt. Trust simply moved away from her. I found that more believable than humiliation would have been. Celeste had spent years building a reputation for judgment and discipline. The damage came from colleagues learning that when a private conflict threatened her, she had bent a system she was supposed to protect. One mistake did not erase 18 years of work, but it changed what people believed she might do with power. That was enough. Cora listened when I told her what Naomi had confirmed, then went back to the sandwich she was making. I watched her spread mustard across the bread, as though we had been discussing weather. For a second, I worried she was shutting down. Then she said the part that showed me she was not. The win, she told me, was not that Celeste had lost the promotion. It was that Cora had not needed to disappear for someone else to stay comfortable. That was all. No celebration. No satisfaction over Celeste's loss. She had stopped measuring justice by whether someone else hurt as much as she had. A week later, Hartwell sent the fellowship decision. This time, Cora opened the email alone. I was folding towels in the living room when I heard her come down the stairs. Her steps were fast but not frantic. She stopped in the doorway with her laptop pressed against her chest. I knew before she spoke. The independent panel had selected her for one of the summer fellowship places. Cora opened the attachment containing the program details and read every line before she let herself celebrate. Start date, housing check-in, stipend schedule, orientation, a list of documents she needed to bring on the first morning. I watched her move through the practical information first, grounding excitement in tasks she could complete. Then she reached the final page, closed the laptop, and laughed in a way I had not heard since before the rejection. The offer did not erase what happened, it did something better. It separated her future from it. Hartwell had not rescued Cora, and the fellowship did not prove she was worthy. The application had already been strong before Celeste touched it. The new review simply restored the chance for that work to count. The letter included no apology, no reference to Celeste, no special explanation. Just the same kind of acceptance any other candidate would receive. 10 weeks in New York. Paid placement. Program housing available. Orientation beginning in late June. For months, Hartwell had carried the weight of everything Celeste represented in our family. In that email, it finally became what Cora had insisted it was from the beginning. A program. An opportunity. Something she had earned. I crossed the room and hugged her. She held on longer than she had when the anonymous score came through. Neither of us said anything profound. We had already said enough. The days between graduation and the fellowship passed quickly. Cora finished high school at 18, surrounded by classmates who had known her through the last years of becoming herself. She wore a cap that never sat straight, complained about the heat beneath the gown, and laughed when Tessa almost tripped walking back to her seat. I took too many photographs. Cora pretended to object. Evelyn came to the small gathering afterward carrying a card and a box of pastries. She told Cora the pantry would survive without her, though the tone made it clear she expected detailed instructions before Cora left. What stayed with me was not anything Evelyn said to Cora. It was the way she talked about her own daughter later that evening. Her daughter lived several states away. They would not see each other again until autumn. Evelyn missed her, but there was no anxiety in the absence. She knew where the relationship lived even when the person did not live nearby. For years, I had admired that, without fully understanding why. Now I did. My experience of motherhood began with someone leaving. Every departure had carried a trace of that first one afterward. A closed door, a suitcase, a car pulling away. Even when Cora was 13 and angry, some primitive part of me had treated distance as danger. If she shut her bedroom door, I feared losing access to her. If she wanted independence, I sometimes heard rejection hiding inside the request. I had grown better at resisting that instinct. I had not eliminated it. Packing for Hartwell brought it back. For several evenings, Cora made lists on her phone and still forgot the same things. I bought travel-sized toiletries she said she could have bought herself. She checked the route from the residence to Hartwell twice and saved the nearest grocery store. We argued mildly about how many shoes one person needed for 10 weeks, then laughed because the argument sounded so ordinary compared with everything Hartwell had meant only a month earlier. Those preparations gave me something useful to do without pretending I could prepare her for adulthood itself. I could wash sheets. I could label an envelope with emergency information she would probably never use. I could make sure the car had gas. The rest belonged to Cora. Cora's suitcase sat open on her bed in late June, half filled with clothes she had arranged badly, and toiletries she kept forgetting to add. The program housing was in New York, close enough that I could reach her without crossing a country, but far enough that she would no longer sleep under my roof every night. She would be gone for 10 weeks. After that, college, different rooms, different schedules, a future that would require less of me in the daily ways that had defined my life since 2008. I folded a sweater and placed it inside the suitcase. Cora took it out because she said nobody needed a sweater that heavy in New York in July. I told her air conditioning existed. She told me so did stores. We compromised by leaving it on the chair. That was motherhood at 51, not grand sacrifice. Arguing about unnecessary knitwear while trying not to think about an empty bedroom. I opened her closet looking for a small travel bag and saw the document box on the upper shelf. For years, it had belonged in my room. After our rupture when Cora was 13, I had moved it where she could access it herself. The box was no longer dangerous, no longer mine to guard. I took it down. Inside were the records I had seen so many times that I could recognize them by texture. The final adoption papers, birth information, The temporary care authorization dated 4 days after Cora's birth. And the hospital bracelet. It rested near the bottom. I held it in my palm. 18 years earlier, that bracelet had seemed to contain the whole story. The day Celeste gave up her daughter. The day my infertility was used as justification. The day a newborn carrier was set at my feet. For years, I had looked at the bracelet and thought of what Celeste did. Standing in Cora's half-packed room, I finally saw how little of Cora's life belonged to that moment. The bracelet did not mark the day Celeste gave me a gift. Cora had never been a gift to transfer. It marked the day she came home. Everything that mattered happened afterward. The fever at 3 months, the family tree assignment, the bad science grade, the truth I withheld, the bedroom floor confrontation, the night she called from the diner, the apology that did not fix everything at once, the pantry, Hartwell, the meeting with Celeste, thousands of breakfasts, thousands of doors opening again after arguments. A family was not created by one handoff. It was created by what people did the next morning. And the morning after that, I returned the bracelet to the box. I did not take it with me. It belonged to Cora now. The morning we drove into New York for orientation, her suitcase was in the trunk. That detail nearly broke me. I could still see another suitcase whenever I looked at it. Celeste's suitcase beside my front door. The parallel was unfair, but memory does not care about fairness. 18 years earlier, Celeste had packed because she wanted to move toward a future that did not include her daughter. Now, I was helping Cora pack because I wanted her future to grow larger than the life she had with me. From far enough away, both scenes contained the same objects. A woman, a girl, a suitcase, a departure. Morally, they could not have been more different. Traffic into Manhattan was heavy enough to keep me occupied for most of the drive. Cora talked about orientation, her assigned project group, and whether the program housing kitchen would have enough space for everyone. I answered normally. At least I think I did. When we reached the residence building, young people and parents were moving through the lobby with rolling bags, boxes, pillows, and nervous energy. Staff members directed fellows toward check-in tables. Cora took charge of her own paperwork. I did not hover over her shoulder. That alone would have impressed the mother I had been when she was 13. We carried her belongings upstairs. The room was small and bright, with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a window overlooking a block of brick buildings. Her roommate had not arrived yet. Cora unpacked only enough to establish territory. Laptop on desk, shoes beneath bed, toiletries in bathroom. The rest could wait. I found myself smoothing a corner of the fitted sheet that did not need smoothing. Then I adjusted the curtain. Then I checked whether the window locked. Cora watched me. There was amusement in her face, but also understanding. She had spent 18 years being raised by a woman whose first experience of motherhood was being handed a baby someone else had left. She knew goodbyes were complicated for me. I picked up my purse. That should have been the moment I simply hugged her and left. Instead, I looked around the room one more time. My mind began producing unnecessary instructions. Call if you need anything. Do not walk alone too late. Remember the building access rules. Keep your phone charged. Eat something besides vending machine food. All reasonable. None necessary at that exact second. Cora stepped closer. For years, I had worried that if I loosened my hold, something would take her. Biology. Anger. The truth. Celeste. Adulthood. But Cora had never needed me to keep her from leaving. She had needed me to make leaving safe. That was different. There's a difference between leaving a child and letting her go, I said. One is about what you want for yourself. The other is about what you want for her. Cora's expression softened. She hugged me. I held her tightly, but not for too long. When we separated, she looked toward the open doorway, and then back at me. Mom, you can go home. I'm not being left. I know where home is. That was the sentence that finished something in me. Not because I had been waiting 18 years to hear that I was her real mother. I no longer needed that contest. Celeste had given birth to Cora. That truth belonged to Cora, and always would. I had raised her. That truth did not need to defeat the first one to matter. I kissed her forehead, picked up my purse, and walked out of the room. I did not turn around 3 times. I did not stand in the hallway listening. I took the elevator down. Outside, late June heat rose from the sidewalk. New York moved around me with the same indifference it had shown the day Cora confronted Celeste. Taxis passed. Someone dragged a suitcase over a crack in the pavement. A delivery truck blocked half the street. I walked to my car alone. For the first time, alone did not mean abandoned. The drive back to New Jersey was strangely quiet. At home, I opened the front door and felt the difference immediately. Cora's shoes were not beside the stairs. Her water bottle was gone from the kitchen counter. The bedroom upstairs was too neat, because most of her life had been packed into bags and carried somewhere else. I stood in the kitchen for a while. 18 years earlier, I had stood in nearly the same place, with a newborn crying against my chest, afraid I had no idea how to become what she needed. Back then, staying had meant feeding her, signing forms, sitting awake through fever, building a life sturdy enough that she would never have to wonder whether one mistake could make me disappear. Now, staying meant something stranger. It meant allowing the distance. I made coffee. I sat at the dining table. I did not call her. For the first half hour, I reached for my phone twice and stopped. There was no emergency to solve, no forgotten form, no reason Cora needed to hear my voice except that I missed hers. Missing her was allowed to belong to me. I did not have to turn it into an obligation for her. About 2 hours later, my phone lit up. A message from Cora. There was a photograph of the view from her window, slightly crooked, because she had apparently taken it while unpacking. Underneath were 5 words. Home safe. Love you, Mom. I read them twice. Then I set the phone down beside my coffee. For most of my life, I had thought family was proven by who refused to leave. Cora taught me that staying also meant admitting when I was wrong, answering when she called after breaking my trust, telling the truth when silence would have been easier, and eventually opening the door without following her through it. Celeste once called Cora a gift. She was wrong. Cora had never belonged to either of us that way. Motherhood had been the privilege of being there while she became herself. The house was quiet around me. This time, I was not afraid of the quiet. I picked up my coffee and looked toward the doorway where Celeste had once left a carrier on the floor. For 18 years, I had remembered that spot as the place my sister walked away from her daughter. That afternoon, I remembered something else. It was also the place where I stayed.